Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and settle into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere at all you need to be. There is a book on the table tonight. Just one. It is called De Materia Medica, and the man who wrote it was Dioscorides, an army physician who walked the roads of the Roman Mediterranean sometime around the middle of the 1st century. It is 5 short volumes, written in Greek, and it describes about 600 plants, along with a few hundred other things besides, the honeys and the milks and the minerals and the wines. Its Greek title means, plainly, on medical material, and for something close to 1500 years afterwards, in Greek, in Syriac, in Arabic, in Latin, in Italian, and Spanish and German, and at last in English. Nobody managed to write anything that replaced it. Physicians simply kept copying it out, correcting it, arguing with it in the margins, and reaching for it again the next morning. That is the whole of our night, one book, and the long, patient line of hands that kept it in use. We will begin with the object itself, and with the man who made it, as far as we can reach him. We will read his preface, where he is quietly cross with everyone who wrote about plants before him. We will walk through his 5 volumes in the order he set them out, from the sweet oils and resins of the 1st book to the mineral cupboard at the end of the 5th. And then we will follow the book outward, into a princess's painted copy, made in Constantinople, into the hands of monks and translators and Ottoman court physicians, into the first printing houses, and at last into the cool, dim rooms where the oldest surviving copies rest tonight under glass. There is no need to remember any of this. Let the names drift past, you like water over stones. If your eyes have closed before we are halfway down the 1st page, that is exactly as it should be, and there is nothing at all that you will have missed. Settle in. Let us open the book. The first thing to say about De Materia Medica is that it was never meant to be beautiful. That may seem an odd place to begin, given that the most famous copy of it in the world is one of the loveliest illuminated manuscripts ever made, 400 painted plants glowing on vellum, made for a princess with more money than almost anyone alive. But that copy came 4.5 centuries after the writing, and it is the exception rather than the rule. The thing Dioscorides actually produced was a working manual. It was written to be consulted quickly by a busy man with a patient waiting, and everything about its construction serves that one purpose. When it left his hands, it was almost certainly a set of papyrus rolls rather than the bound book we picture when we hear the word. The codex, the stacked and stitched form that we still use, was only beginning its long rise in the 1st century, and most serious literature of the period still traveled as rolls. 5 books meant, in practice, 5 rolls, each one perhaps 20 or 30 feet of papyrus wound onto a wooden spindle kept in a leather bucket or a cylindrical case with the other rolls of a physician's small library. To find a particular remedy, you unwound with one hand and wound up with the other, your eyes traveling down the narrow columns of Greek letters as the roll passed. It was not a fast way to look something up, which may be part of why the ordering of the work mattered so much to him, and why he thought about it so hard. The text itself was unadorned. Continuous Greek capitals, no spaces between the words, very little punctuation. The columns ruled narrow so the eye would not lose its line. There were probably no illustrations at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the picture most of us carry of an ancient herbal is a picture of paintings, and the paintings came later. Dioscorides knew perfectly well that illustrated herbals existed. He mentions the tradition. He simply did not think much of it as a way of teaching someone to recognize a plant. And he said so, and his book went out into the world as words alone. What those words covered was a great deal. The 5 books together describe somewhere between 600 and 700 plants. Depending on how you count the varieties, he treats as separate, and the ones he folds together, and around 1,000 distinct medicinal substances in total, once you add the animal products and the minerals. Something like 90 of those substances are mineral, drawn out of mines and furnaces and the sea. Something like 35 come from animals, from the honey bee, and the sheep and the snail and the beaver. The rest is green and growing and gathered. It is worth pausing on who all of that was for. The obvious answer is physicians, and physicians certainly used it, but the book has a wider audience built into it than that. There were, in the ancient world, several distinct trades standing between a growing plant and a sick person, and Dioscorides seems to have had all of them in mind. There were the rhizotomists, the root cutters, who went out into the hills and dug and gathered and brought material down to the towns. There were the drug sellers in the markets, the pharmacopoli, who bought from the gatherers and sold on, and who had a reputation, not always deserved and not always undeserved, for selling one thing under the name of another. There were the ointment makers and perfumers, whose craft overlapped almost completely with the first book of the work. And there were ordinary householders, particularly the women who ran large households, who prepared most of the remedies that were ever actually swallowed in the ancient world, and who never appear in any professional register at all. A book that tells you where a plant grows, how to recognize it, when to gather it, how to dry it, how to spot a bad batch, and how much to give is a book aimed at every single one of those hands, not just the learned one at the end of the chain. And it was used by all of them, which is really the answer to the puzzle in the title we began with. Books do not survive 1,500 years because they are admired. They survive because somebody keeps needing them, and therefore keeps paying a scribe to copy them, and copying was expensive, and nobody paid for a copy out of sentiment. Every surviving manuscript of Dioscorides represents a decision taken by some particular person in some particular decade, that this text was worth the price of the skins and the months of a copyist's time. That decision was taken over and over, in Greek monasteries and Baghdad translation rooms and Italian cathedral libraries and Ottoman court dispensaries, for something like 60 generations, without a serious break. It is one of the longest unbroken chains of practical usefulness that any book in any language can show. That word material, in the old title, is doing more work than it looks. In Greek, the word he used was hyl, which means matter or stuff, or the raw timber of a thing before anyone has made anything of it. On medical material, not on medicine, not on healing, not on the physician's art, on the raw stuff that medicine is made from. It is a modest and rather beautiful way of describing what he set out to do. He was not writing a theory of the body. He was not explaining what illness was or where it came from. He was writing down what things are, where they grow, what they smell and taste like, what they do, and how much of them a person may safely take. The theory could be somebody else's business. That name stuck, too, and stuck for a very long time indeed. Materia Medica became the standing name for the whole discipline of knowing drugs and their sources. Medical schools taught chairs of Materia Medica into the 20th century. There are physicians alive today who were examined in a subject named after a 1st century Greek book, and the name only slipped quietly out of the timetable within living memory, replaced by the tidier word pharmacology. It is one of the quieter measures of how long the shadow of this one text lay across the whole business of medicine. The 5 books have their own proportions, and the proportions tell you something. The first book, on aromatics and oils and resins and trees, is not the longest, but it is the richest and the most expensive in its contents, full of cinnamon and myrrh and spikenard and saffron, the sorts of things that arrived in the Mediterranean by long trade routes and cost real money. The second book comes down to earth entirely, into honey and milk and butter and eggs and grains and pot herbs and the flesh of ordinary creatures. The third and fourth books are the great green middle of the work, roots and juices and herbs and seeds, hundreds of them, one after another. And the fifth turns to the vine, to wine and vinegar, and the medicated wines made by steeping herbs in them, and then, at the very end, to the earths and stones and metals, the litharge and the calamine, and the burnt copper of the ancient dispensary. Read straight through. It is not a work anyone would call gripping. It is a list, chapter after chapter of the same shape, opening with the plant's name, moving through where it grows, and what it looks like and what it does, closing with a caution or a dose. Its greatness is not literary. It is that the list is right far more often than a list assembled in the 1st century has any business being, and that the man assembling it consistently marks the difference between what he has seen with his own eyes and what he has been told by someone else. It is worth saying plainly how many copies we are talking about, because the number is one of the reasons the whole story hangs together. Manuscripts of Dioscorides in Greek, in Latin, in Arabic, in Syriac, in Hebrew, and in half a dozen other languages survive today in the hundreds, scattered across the libraries of Europe and the Near East, and now also across the collections of America. That is what has come down to us after fires and floods and sieges and mode, and the ordinary attrition of 15 centuries, and the number that once existed must have been very much larger. Very few technical works of antiquity survive in anything approaching those quantities. Most survive in a handful of copies, or in one, or in fragments, or not at all, and we know of their contents only because someone else quoted them. This one is everywhere. They are not all the same book, either, and this is a thing worth holding lightly in mind through the whole of the night ahead. There is no single authoritative text of Materia Medica sitting somewhere waiting to be consulted. There are families of manuscripts related to one another the way dialects are, each descended from earlier copies through its own particular line of accidents. One family keeps the original ordering. Another is alphabetical. Some contain chapters that others lack. Some carry additions made centuries after his death by readers who thought a plant deserved a mention. Modern printed editions are reconstructions, put together by scholars comparing manuscripts and making judgments, and they are honest about being so. The book also has a physical modesty that lasted. Even after it moved from rolls into codices, even after 1,000 years of copying, the great majority of the copies of Dioscorides that survive are plain working books. Small, hard-used, written in a clear hand, with wide-ish margins because the owner would want room to write in them. Stained at the corners where wet fingers turned the page. Some of them have the outline of a pressed leaf still faintly visible, where a reader tucked a specimen in against the relevant chapter and forgot it. The gilded princess's copy in Vienna is what everybody photographs, but the true life of this book was lived in volumes like these, on a shelf above a workbench, within reach of somebody's hand. Let us turn now to the man who wrote it, and to how very little we are able to say about him with any certainty at all. His name was Pedanius Dioscorides, and he came from Anazarbus, a town in Cilicia, in the south-eastern corner of what is now Turkey, tucked between the Taurus Mountains and the sea. It was a Greek-speaking place inside a Roman province, which describes his whole position rather neatly. He was a Greek by language and education, and a Roman subject by circumstance, and his first name, Pedanius, is a Roman family name, which suggests that at some point he, or an ancestor, received citizenship through the patronage of a Roman family called the Pedanii. This was ordinary enough. The Eastern Mediterranean of the 1st century was full of educated Greeks with Roman names, doing skilled work for the empire. Anazarbus sat on the plain below a long ridge of rock, with the mountains on one side, and beyond the low country, the road running east towards Syria. It was a market town on a trading road, not a great city, and a boy growing up there would have seen caravans coming down out of the passes and heard half a dozen languages in the square on any given morning. He would also have seen a very great number of plants. Cilicia is a botanically generous place, and the ground rises quickly from marshy coastal flats to dry hillside to mountain, so that a person willing to walk for a day can pass through several entirely different floras. Whatever else made him, that landscape probably made him first. He seems to have studied at Tarsus, the largest city along the coast, which had a considerable reputation for learning in general and for pharmacology in particular. The man he addresses his book to, a physician named Areius, is described as being of Tarsus, and the affectionate, slightly deferential tone of that address reads very like a former student writing to a teacher, or at least to an older colleague he respects. Alexandria has also been suggested as part of his training, since Alexandria was where anyone serious about medicine went if they could. But that is inference rather than record. And then, in the preface, he tells us the one substantial fact about his own life that we have from his own hand. He says that he led, in his words, a soldier's life. 2 words, and an entire biography has been built on them. The usual reading, and it is a reasonable one, is that he served as a physician attached to the Roman army, which would place him in the reigns of Claudius and then Nero, and which would explain the extraordinary geographical range of the book. He knows plants of Italy, and plants of Greece, and plants of Egypt, and plants of the Levant. He knows what the people in one region call a herb, and what quite different people call the same herb somewhere else. He knows where the best specimens of a particular root come from, and where you are likely to be sold a poor one. That is not the knowledge of a man who stayed at home and read. The army of the 1st century moved constantly, and a physician moved with it, and while the marching was hard, it did offer one thing that no private practitioner could buy at any price. It offered the roads. A doctor with a legion crossed provinces, wintered in unfamiliar country, met local healers and local herb sellers in a dozen towns, and had reason to ask each of them what they used and what they called it. Some scholars have been cautious about how literally to take the soldier's life, and have pointed out that his descriptions cluster most heavily around the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than ranging evenly across the whole empire. It is possible he traveled as a merchant's physician, or simply as a man with a purpose and a strong pair of legs. The honest position is that he traveled a great deal, and that the book could not exist otherwise. It is worth picturing, for a moment, what the work itself would have looked like. A legionary physician of the 1st century traveled with a chest, and the chest held a set of bronze instruments, probes and scalpels and forceps and cautery irons, and alongside them the dried and powdered and infused materials that made up his dispensary. Wounds were the daily business, and after wounds came fevers, and after fevers came the ordinary miseries of men living close together in bad weather, coughs and gut trouble, and skin complaints and eyes inflamed by dust. There were bandages to be boiled and rolled, salves to be made up in advance, because there would be no time to make them later, wine to be checked, and vinegar to be kept. And when the chest ran low, as it must constantly have done, the physician walked out into whatever country the army happened to be sitting in and looked for a local substitute, which meant asking the people who lived there what they used. Almost every good thing in Materia Medica has that shape somewhere behind it. He also inherited a great deal, and he knew it. Greek medicine already had centuries of written tradition when he sat down, running back through the Hippocratic writings to a world where the physician and the herb gatherer were barely distinguished. Theophrastus, the successor of Aristotle, had written 2 long enquiries into plants some 350 years earlier, and they are extraordinary works of observation. But they are the work of a natural philosopher wanting to understand how plants live, not a practitioner wanting to know what to do on Tuesday morning. Others had written specifically on drugs, and Dioscorides had clearly read them. What he seems to have concluded, reading them, was that the material was there in quantity, and that nobody had yet arranged it in a way that a person could actually use under pressure. That conclusion is the seed of the whole book, and he says so almost in as many words on his opening page. Beyond this, the record is nearly silent. We do not know when he was born or when he died, though a working life somewhere between about the year 40 and the year 90 fits the evidence. We do not know whether he married or had children. We do not know what he looked like, and every picture of him that has ever been painted is an invention, including the very fine ones. There is an inscription from Anazarbus that mentions a Dioscorides, and it may or may not be him. There is no tomb, no letter, no anecdote from a contemporary. Galen, writing a century later, praises the work at length and tells us almost nothing about the author, which suggests that by then there was already nothing much to tell. The world he worked in is a little easier to see than the man. Medicine in the Roman Empire of the 1st century was, to a striking degree, a Greek profession. Greek was the language of medical learning. Greek physicians practiced in Rome itself in considerable numbers, and Roman writers of the old-fashioned sort complained about it regularly and were ignored. A physician had no license and no register, and no formal qualification. He had a reputation, and he had whatever training he had managed to obtain. And the range of competence within the trade must have been enormous, running from men of real learning down to those who had picked up a few remedies and a confident manner. A book that let a careful practitioner check what he thought he knew in a field where nobody could check him was a genuinely valuable thing to own. He was also writing at a moment when the empire was, briefly, an easier place to move around in than it had ever been or would be again for a very long time. The roads were made and maintained. The sea was comparatively free of pirates. A person with a reason to travel could go from Spain to Syria without crossing a hostile frontier, and could expect the coinage to be good and the language to be understood at either end. A book compiling the plants of the whole Mediterranean at once could only be written in a world shaped like that, and it is one of the small ironies of the story that the empire which made the book possible then fell, while the book carried on. What we do have, oddly, is his temperament. It comes through the prose with real clarity, and it is one of the pleasures of the book. He is careful. He dislikes exaggeration. When he thinks a claim is doubtful, he says that it is reported, or that some people say so, and steps back from it. When he has tested something himself, he says so, plainly, with a kind of quiet satisfaction. He is unimpressed by magical users, and records a few of them anyway, out of completeness, with an audible shrug. He is interested in fraud, and returns again and again to how you can tell a good drug from an adulterated one, which is the concern of a man who has been cheated in a market and did not enjoy it. He notices smells. He notices which plants have a bitter aftertaste and which have a clean one. He is, in short, exactly the sort of person you would want compiling this kind of list, and it is a small piece of good fortune for the whole of European medicine that the job fell to him, rather than to somebody more imaginative. There is one more thing worth holding on to about him before we open the preface. He was not, so far as anything indicates, an important man. He held no chair, founded no school, attracted no followers in his lifetime that we know of, and left no trace in the political or literary gossip of his century. He was a working physician who walked a great deal, wrote things down carefully, and organized them well. 1,500 years of medicine rested on that. It is a thought worth taking gently into the dark with you, if you are still awake to take anything at all. Let us turn now to the opening of the book, which is not a chapter at all, but a letter. Ancient books very often began this way, addressed to a particular person by name, the way you might begin a long explanation to a friend who had asked you for it. The letter that opens De Materia Medica is addressed to a man called Areius, a physician of Tarsus, and it is warm without being effusive. Dioscorides thanks him for his goodwill, refers to their shared acquaintance, and mentions a man named Licanius Bassus, who appears to have been a Roman of some standing known to them both. That single name is one of the few threads we have for dating the work at all, since Licanius Bassus held the consulship in the 60s of the 1st century, and if it is the same man, then the book was written and circulated somewhere around then, in the reign of Nero. It is a strange thing to build a date on, a courteous mention of a mutual friend. But that is very often how ancient chronology is made. Having done the courtesies, he gets to his complaint, and the complaint takes up most of the preface. His trouble with the existing literature is not that there is too little of it. There was, by the 1st century, a great deal written about drugs and plants, and he had clearly read most of it. His trouble is that it was unreliable, and unreliable in particular ways that he can name. Some writers, he says, treated the subject only in passing, mentioning a few herbs on the way to something else. Others wrote at more length, but described plants they had plainly never looked at, copying from books rather than from ground, so that errors passed from one author to the next unexamined and grew more confident with each retelling. Others still gave the properties of a drug wrongly, saying a thing warmed when it cooled, or that it bound when it loosened, which in practice meant that a physician trusting the book might do the opposite of what he intended. He names names, which is bracing to read in a work otherwise so mild. He mentions Ilus of Bithynia and Heraclides of Tarentum as men who touched on herbs too briefly. He mentions Crachuas and Andreas as having gone considerably further, and gives them their due, but says they still left out a great many roots and useful herbs. And he is coolest of all about a writer named Sextius Niger, whom he accuses of carelessness and of setting down properties that simply are not so. There is a whole small world visible behind these sentences, a professional community in which people read one another and disagreed, and had opinions about who was sound and who was not, exactly as they would today, and almost none of the books involved have survived for us to check him against. Crachuas is worth stopping on, because he is the ghost that stands behind this whole tradition. He was a rhizotomist, a root cutter, and he served Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, the monarch famous for his lifelong obsession with poisons and antidotes. Crachuas is the first person we know of to have made an illustrated herbal, a book in which each plant was painted and given a short note on its properties. None of it survives as a book. What survives are fragments quoted by later writers, and a strong suspicion among scholars that some of the paintings in the great illuminated copies of Dioscorides, made centuries afterwards, descend by a long chain of copying from Crachua's own pictures. If that is right, and it is generally thought likely, then some of the plant portraits that people go to Vienna to look at today are the great-grandchildren of paintings made for a king who died in the 1st century before our era. That is the sort of thread that runs through the whole of this subject, invisible until someone points it out. There is a second reason he distrusted books copied from books, and it is one that anyone who has ever tried to identify a plant from a description will recognize at once. Plant names in the ancient Mediterranean were a thicket. The same herb carried different names in Attica, and in Egypt, and among the Dacians and among the Romans, and quite different herbs carried the same name, in places only a few days' travel apart. A physician reading a remedy, written down 200 miles away, and a century earlier could very easily gather the wrong plant in perfect good faith. Dioscorides took this seriously enough that many of his chapters open with a small heap of alternative names: the Greek, the Latin, sometimes the Egyptian, or the African, or the Dacian, laid down side by side, so that a reader in one country could match what he had in his hand against what the book was talking about. Some scholars think these synonym lists grew considerably in later copying, added to by generations of readers doing exactly what he intended. Either way, they are the sound of a man trying very hard to be understood by somebody a long way off. It is worth remembering, too, how a book actually spread in the 1st century, because it explains a good deal about what happened next. There was no publisher. A work circulated because its author gave copies to friends, and because those friends had their own copies made by their own household scribes, and because a bookseller in a large city might keep a few copies of a well-regarded text to sell. Every single copy was made by a human being reading one manuscript aloud or under the breath and writing it down again, and every single copy therefore introduced its own small crop of errors. A text that lasted 15 centuries in this way is not one text. It is a long river of slightly different texts, each one descended from the last, and the work of tracing them back towards a source has occupied scholars for generations. What is remarkable about Dioscorides is how well the substance held together across all that copying. The plants stayed recognizable. The doses stayed sensible. Whatever else went astray, the thing kept working. His second complaint is about arrangement, and it is the one he cares about most. A number of earlier writers, he says, had arranged their material alphabetically. This looks sensible to us, and it looked sensible to them, and Dioscorides thought it was a mistake. His reasoning is entirely practical. An alphabetical list scatters plants that belong together. The herbs that cool a fever end up spread across the whole book at random, filed under the accidents of their names, and the person using the book never comes to see them as a family. Worse, he says, it makes the material impossible to hold in memory, and memory was the point. A physician in the field could not carry 5 rolls of papyrus up a mountain. What he carried was what he had learned, and a book that helps you learn is arranged so that related things sit next to each other and support one another in the mind. So he arranged his by what he called the power of the drugs, their dynamis, grouping together the things that do similar work in the body. The warming things with the warming things, the binding with the binding, the loosening with the loosening. This has a further advantage that he does not spell out, but which every practitioner would have felt at once. If you know that a particular root sits among a certain neighborhood of drugs, then on the day when that root is not to be had, and in the ancient world it very often was not to be had, you already know its neighbors, and can reach for one of them instead. The arrangement is not just a filing system. It is a working substitution table, built into the shape of the book. There is a quiet irony waiting at the end of this argument, and we may as well meet it now rather than later. Within a few centuries, copyists had rearranged De Materia Medica alphabetically anyway. They did it for the most understandable of reasons, because a reader who knows the name of a plant and wants to find it fast is served by the alphabet and nothing else, and because by then most readers were consulting the book rather than learning it. the single most magnificent surviving copy in the world, the one made in Constantinople for a princess, is alphabetical from beginning to end. The author's most strongly argued structural decision was politely overruled by the people who loved his book most, and the book survived anyway, which tells you something about what actually keeps a text alive. There was a live argument in his century about pictures in books of plants, and it is worth setting out because it sounds so odd to us. Nobody doubted that a good painting helped. The objection was to what happened to paintings afterwards. A picture in a hand-copied book has to be copied by hand too, by somebody who is very often not an artist and has very often never seen the subject, and the objection was that a copied picture degrades where copied words do not. Pliny, writing at almost the same time, put the case bluntly. Pictures, he said, are deceptive because a plant changes its appearance through the seasons and a single image can only show one moment of it, and because the copying corrupts them. Whether Dioscorides shared that view in so many words we cannot say. What we can say is that his book went out as words, and that his descriptions are so much better than anyone else's of the period, that they read like the work of a man who has decided that the words must do the whole job on their own, and they very nearly do. He tells you the height and the habit of the plant, the shape and the cut, and the texture of the leaf, whether it is rough or smooth to the hand, the color and arrangement of the flower, the smell when it is bruised, the taste on the tongue, the character of the root, the ground it likes, and the season it shows itself in. Anyone who has tried to identify a plant from a written description will know how rare it is for all of that to be present and correct. There are chapters in which he does it in 4 sentences. It is genuinely fine technical prose, achieved in a genre nobody thought of as literature at all. And the later centuries which added paintings back in did so not because his descriptions had failed, but because pictures are quicker. He closes the letter with the thing that matters more than any of the argument. He says, in effect, that he has seen most of these plants himself. Where he has not, he has asked carefully among the people who live where they grow, and has weighed what he was told. He asks Areius, and by extension anyone else reading, to judge the work not by its style, which he does not claim much for, but by whether it is accurate, and he asks it in the tone of a man who fully expects to be checked. In an age when a great deal of natural history was assembled by educated men, sitting in libraries, reading other educated men, that plain claim to have gone and looked is the whole of his advantage, and it is why we are still talking about him. We turn now to the shape of the whole work, and to what is actually in each of the 5 books. The first book is the aromatic one, and it opens the way a rich man's cupboard opens, with the expensive things at the front: iris and spikenard, cardamom and cinnamon, saffron and sweet flag. Then the oils, and the long, patient business of making scented oils by steeping plant material in them. Then the trees and the shrubs, and the things that weep out of them, mastic and myrrh and frankincense and pitch, and the various gums. Then fruits, and the oils pressed from seeds and kernels. It is the book a perfumer would have wanted as much as a physician, and in the ancient world that overlap was not a curiosity. The ointment maker and the drug maker used the same vessels, the same fats, and often the same shop. The second book comes down out of the incense clouds and into the kitchen. It begins with living creatures and the things they give, honey above all, and then milk, cheese, butter, fats and marrow, eggs, wool, grease, and a whole assortment of small animals from the snail to the sea urchin. Then it turns to grain and pulses, wheat and barley and millet and lentil and bean, and then to the sharp herbs, the garlic and onion and leek and mustard and cress and radish, the things that bite the tongue. If the first book is the world of caravans and expensive resin, the second is the world of the farmyard and the market stall, and it makes plain that the border between food and medicine in the ancient world was not a border at all, but a slow gradient. The third and fourth books together form the great green middle. Roots, juices, herbs and seeds, hundreds of them, running one after another for what would be several hours of steady reading. This is where the ordinary working pharmacy of the Mediterranean lives. Gentian and wormwood and licorice and centaury, chamomile and plantain and yarrow, fennel and dill and cumin and coriander, sage and rosemary and thyme and mint, and dozens upon dozens of plants whose names have shifted or vanished, and whose identity scholars still argue over gently. Towards the later part of the fourth book, the material darkens, and we reach the poisons and the narcotics. The plants a physician needed to know about precisely, so that he could handle them carefully or recognize what had happened when someone else had not. The fifth book turns to the vine, wine first, in all its kinds, sweet and rough and old and new, and then the enormous family of medicated wines, made by steeping herbs or roots or resins in wine and letting them stand. Then vinegar and its preparations, including oxymel, the mixture of vinegar and honey that stayed in European medicine for the next 17 centuries. And then, in the last stretch of the last book, the work leaves the growing world altogether and goes into the earth, to the mineral substances, the litharge and white lead and calamine, and verdigris, and burnt copper and alum, and the various earths, materials that came out of mines and furnaces and were prepared with fire. Imagine for a moment an ordinary morning for someone who owned this book. A man comes to the door with a child who has been coughing for a fortnight and cannot sleep for it. You know already, without opening anything, 3 or 4 things you would reach for. But the child is small, and one of your usual remedies is a little strong for a small child, and you want to check the quantity. So you take down the roll, or later the volume, find the neighborhood you want, run your eye down to the chapter, and there it is, what it does, how to prepare it, how much, and in what, and a line telling you what happens if you give more than that. You put the book back and get on with the morning. That is the whole of it, repeated a few times a week for a working lifetime, and repeated by tens of thousands of people across 15 centuries. There is nothing dramatic in it anywhere. The reason we are spending a night on this book is not that anything remarkable ever happened to it. It is that nothing remarkable happened to it, over and over, for longer than almost any other book has managed. That progression is worth noticing, because it is not random, and it is not alphabetical, and it is not exactly by power either. The work moves, book by book, from the things you smell and rub on the skin, through the things you eat, into the things you take specifically as medicine, and finally into the things that are made in a workshop rather than gathered anywhere. It is a journey from the outside of the body inward, and from the living world into the mineral one. Whether Dioscorides intended it quite so neatly is impossible to say. But a reader working through it in order finds the ground steadily changing beneath them in a way that feels deliberate, and it is one of the reasons the book reads better as a whole than a list of 800 entries has any right to. The 5 books add up, in the versions that have come down to us, to something in the region of 800 separate chapters, though the exact count varies from manuscript to manuscript, because later hands added and merged and occasionally dropped things. Most of those chapters are short, a paragraph or 2, sometimes only a few lines for a minor plant, occasionally a full page for something important like opium or hellebore or honey. The brevity is deliberate, and it is part of why the work traveled so well. A long, discursive treatment is a pleasure to read once and a nuisance to consult 1,000 times. And this is a book meant to be consulted 1,000 times. Why 5 books, rather than 3 or 8, is partly a question of physical convenience. A papyrus roll has a natural comfortable length, beyond which it becomes heavy and awkward and prone to tearing at the spindle, and ancient authors habitually divided long works into units that fitted that length. 5 rolls was a substantial, but not unreasonable set for a working physician to own and carry, the sort of thing that would sit in one bucket beside the bed. When the whole tradition moved from rolls into bound codices a few centuries later, the 5-fold division was kept, even though a codex could easily have held the lot in one volume. By then the divisions had become part of how people talked about the work. You did not say a page number, you said the 3rd book, and everybody knew roughly where you were. Living with the arrangement day to day would have felt something like living with a well-organized workshop. You would not read it front to back after the first time. You would go to the neighborhood you needed. If a patient had a wound that would not close, your mind went to a particular stretch of the 3rd book, and everything in that stretch was already familiar as a group. If someone had eaten something they should not have, you went to another neighborhood entirely, and the remedies there sat beside one another, because they did the same kind of work. The younger physician learning his trade did not memorize 800 separate facts. He memorized perhaps 30 or 40 neighborhoods, and then filled each one in slowly over the years, and that is a task a human mind can actually accomplish. Scholars have argued for a very long time about how strictly the affinity principle actually holds. In places it is unmistakable. Whole runs of chapters where each plant clearly belongs with its neighbors, and the logic of the grouping is plain. In other places the thread seems to slip, and a chapter appears where no obvious reason puts it. Some of that may be his own inconsistency. A good deal of it is almost certainly the work of later hands, since a text copied and recopied and reorganized across 15 centuries accumulates additions, and there are chapters in the received text that most scholars think were not his at all. Sorting the original from the accretions is a slow and rather beautiful piece of philological archaeology that is still going on, and there is no need at all for you to follow it tonight. Let us turn now to a single chapter of the book and to the quiet, repeating shape that every one of them shares. Open the Materia Medica anywhere and you land in the same pattern. It begins with the name of the thing, and then, very often, a small string of other names, the ones it goes by elsewhere. Then a sentence or two on where it grows, and what kind of ground it likes, and whether the sort from one region is better than the sort from another. Then the description, which is the part he took most trouble over, working down from the leaf to the stem to the flower to the root, noting the color and the scent, and how the leaf feels between the fingers. Then the properties, given in a compact technical vocabulary. Then the uses, listed by complaint. Then, if it applies, the dose, and the way to prepare it, and a warning about what happens if you give too much. And then, quite often, a last note on how it should be gathered and kept, or how you can tell a false one from a true one. It never varies much, and that is the whole of its power. A reader who has worked through 50 chapters knows exactly where in a chapter to look for the piece of information wanted, and can find it at a glance without reading a word of the rest. The uniformity that makes the book a little dull to read straight through is precisely what makes it a superb thing to use. And a very great many technical books written since have arrived at the same discovery by their own roots. Consider the vocabulary of the properties, because it is a small language of its own. Things are described as warming or cooling, and as drying or moistening. They are binding, which is to say astringent, drawing the flesh together, or they are softening, relaxing what is tight. They are said to be thinning, or thickening, or cleansing, or to draw out, or to fill up a hollow wound with new flesh. They provoke urine, or sweat, or sleep. They settle the stomach or move the bowel. There are perhaps 30 or 40 of these terms used with real consistency, and once you have them, the entire book becomes legible. It is a system of description that does not depend on any theory of what causes disease, which is one reason it survived so many centuries in which the theories changed completely around it. The doses come in ancient measures, and reading them is a pleasant way to be reminded how differently the world once weighed things. A drachma, a little under 4 grams by our reckoning, is the common unit for a powdered drug. An obol is a sixth of that. Liquids come by the kyathos and the cotyle, cup measures rather than weights. And there is the oxybaphon, the little vinegar saucer, which appears again and again as a convenient small measure of liquid, because everybody's table had one. There is something very domestic about a pharmacology, measured partly in kitchenware, and it fits the world he was writing for, in which the same person who ground the drug had very likely also made the supper. Almost nothing was given on its own. A powder went into wine, or into honey water, or into vinegar, or into warmed milk, or into a thin barley gruel, and which of these you chose was itself part of the treatment, since wine was warming and vinegar cutting and barley water soothing. Externally, the same materials appeared as poultices spread on cloth, as plasters stiffened with wax and resin, as salves worked into oil or fat, as washes, as steams inhaled over a bowl, and as the little pastilles called troches made up in advance, dried hard, and dissolved when needed. The book assumes you know how to do all of this, and mostly tells you only which form to use, which is another sign of who it was written for. Take a plain example. His chapter on chamomile distinguishes several kinds by the color of the flower, notes that it grows in rough places and along paths, describes the small daisy head and the finely cut leaf, and then gives its work. The decoction, he says, warms and thins and softens, and is used in baths for aches and for troubles of the bladder, and to bring on what is delayed, and the flowers are laid on the eyes for inflammation. Then a caution about which kind is bitter and less pleasant to take. It is perhaps 200 words in the Greek, and there is not a wasted phrase in it, and a herbalist of the 16th century could have picked it up and gone straight to work. Take a third example of a different kind, one of the mineral entries, and you can see the same module bending to fit an entirely different material. On alum, he tells you where the best comes from, describes the good sort as white and clean, and readily crumbling, and strongly astringent on the tongue, distinguishes the several forms by how they break and what shape the pieces take, and then gives the uses which run to the mouth, and the gums, and to bleeding, and to wounds that will not dry. Then how it is prepared, by roasting until it puffs and loses its water. Then a caution about strength. It is the same 8 movements as a plant chapter, in the same order, applied to something dug out of the ground. That flexibility is quietly impressive, and it is the reason the 5th book does not feel like a different work bolted on to the end. The module was imitated for a very long time afterwards, usually without acknowledgement, because it works. Open a herbal from any century between his and the 19th, and you will find some version of the same sequence, name and synonyms and habitat and description and virtues and preparation and caution. Sometimes there is a section on the governing planet added in, sometimes a scriptural reference, sometimes a poem. The bones underneath are his. Even the standard entry in a modern reference work on medicinal plants, with its headings for botanical description, distribution, constituents, traditional uses and contraindications, is recognizably a descendant, arrived at independently perhaps, but arriving in the same place because the same job produces the same shape. Take a costly example, and the tone shifts slightly. On cinnamon he becomes noticeably more careful, because cinnamon came a very long way and cost a very great deal, and where there is money there is fraud. He distinguishes several sorts, describes the good bark as smooth and close, grained and pungent and slightly biting on the tongue, and tells you what the poor and adulterated kinds look and taste like instead. This concern runs right through the book. He tells you how to test whether opium has been bulked out with other juices, how a false balsam behaves in water, how to know a good saffron by rubbing it and watching the color, how a resin should break when you snap it. It is the most practical possible kind of writing, and it is the part that a merchant would have valued as much as a physician. There is another kind of use tucked into a good many chapters, and it belongs to the farmyard rather than the sick room. He records what a thing does for animals: a remedy for a horse's swollen leg, a wash for a dog, something to be given to cattle, a fumigation for a buyer. Livestock were wealth, and a household that lost a working ox lost a great deal more than a household that lost a week of its own labor, so the veterinary line in a chapter was not an afterthought. It is one of the details that reminds you the book was made for people who lived close to animals and could not afford to be sentimental about them or careless with them either. And there are the plainly domestic uses which drift in and out without ceremony. A plant that also dyes cloth, a root that also cleans wool, a seed that also keeps moths out of stored garments, a gum that makes a good glue, a bark that tans a hide, an ash that helps a fire draw. The book never pretends that its materials belong solely to medicine, because in the world it was written for nothing, belongs solely to anything. The same jar on the same shelf served the sick child in the morning, and the stained tunic in the afternoon, and Dioscorides mentions both without any sense that he is changing the subject. He records the non-medical uses too, sometimes with visible reluctance. A plant hung over the door against ill fortune, a root worn about the neck, a leaf placed under a pillow for dreaming. He sets these down because he is making a complete account of what people do with these materials, and then quite often adds a small phrase to distance himself, that it is said so, or that some report it. He is not scornful about it. He simply declines to vouch for it, and moves on. That habit of separating what he will stand behind from what he is merely recording is, to a modern reader, one of the most likable things about him, and it is rarer in ancient natural history than you might expect. And finally, tucked into a great many chapters, there is a last line or two about the keeping of the thing, and that is a subject he cared about enough to give it its own place in the preface. We turn now to the gathering and the drying and the storing, which is where the whole book touches most directly on the ordinary work of a still room. His argument begins with the ground the plant grew in, and it is an argument that anyone who has ever grown herbs will recognize. The strongest material, he says, comes from high places, from hillsides that are dry and windy and open to the weather, from cold country and ground that gives the plant a hard time. What grows in low, damp, shaded, comfortable places, in the fat soil of a river plain or under trees, is weaker and waterier, however handsome it looks. He goes further and says that the season matters as much as the place, that a wet year yields feebler drugs than a dry one, and that a herb gathered out of its proper month is worth considerably less than the same herb gathered in it. Modern chemistry, when it eventually got round to measuring these things, found a good deal in this that holds up, since a plant under stress often produces more of the compounds we now call active. He arrived at it by paying attention. Then he goes part by part. Flowers are to be gathered when they are fully out and before they begin to drop. Seeds when they are ripe and beginning to dry on the plant. Stalks and leaves in their fullness, while they are still green and firm and before they begin to yellow. Fruits when they are grown but not yet soft. Roots and rhizomes in the autumn, after the leaves have died back and the strength of the plant has withdrawn downwards into the earth, or else in earliest spring before it rises again. Gums and juices and resins are to be taken in dry, settled weather, since damp spoils them at the moment of collection and no amount of later care recovers it. Every one of these rules turns up again, almost word for word, in herbals written 1500 years afterwards, usually without any mention of where it came from. The drying he treats as a craft in itself. Herbs are to be dried in the shade rather than in the sun, in a place with moving air, spread out rather than heaped and turned. Sun dries fast and takes the scent and the color with it. A shaded loft with a draught through it does the work more slowly and keeps more of the plant intact. When the material is dry, it should be handled as little as possible. because rubbing and crumbling releases what you have been at pains to preserve. This is exactly the advice a good herb dryer would give today, and it is worth remembering that it was written down before the Colosseum was built. Then the vessels, and here he is very specific. Dry herbs he would have kept in boxes of lime wood, which is close grained and does not taint what is put in it. Some materials do better wrapped in paper or in leaves. Moist things, the juices and the thickened saps, want glass or horn, or in some cases vessels of tin or silver, and he notes which substances will spoil a container and which containers will spoil a substance. Ointments and the eye salves, he says, are best kept in copper. Damp is the enemy of nearly everything, and so is heat, and so is light, and a store cupboard should be cool and dry and dark, which is the same instruction printed on the back of a jar of dried herbs in any shop today. He also tells you how long things last, which is the part most later herbals quietly omit. Roots, seeds, and the dried juices hold their strength for a good while, several years in some cases, if they are kept properly. Flowers and green herbs do not. They should be looked at each year and renewed, and the old stock thrown out or put to some lesser use, however wasteful that feels. He knew perfectly well that a physician who dosed a patient from a 3-year-old jar of flowers was, in effect, giving nothing at all. And that giving nothing while believing you have given something is worse than giving nothing knowingly. There is one small detail in all of this that has always struck readers as particularly his. He advises that you should look at your store and smell it and taste a little where tasting is safe, rather than trusting the label and the date. A good drug announces itself. The color is still true. The scent still lifts when you rub it between your palms. The taste is still sharp or bitter or aromatic in the way it should be. When those have gone dull, the virtue has gone with them, whatever the jar says. It is an instruction to keep using your own senses instead of your own records. And it is the sort of thing a man says who has been let down once by a jar and did not care for the experience. Picture, if it helps, the room all of this describes, because it is a room that changed remarkably little for 2,000 years. A low space with a draught through it, and cords or poles running below the beams with bundles hanging from them, tied at the stem and hung head down. Boxes along a shelf, lidded, each one holding one thing. Glass or horn vessels for the wet materials, stoppered and sealed with wax. A scale, a mortar, a bench with a stone slab on it for grinding. A window with a cloth over it against the light. A book, if the owner is prosperous or learned or both, within reach. Change the details a little, and you have a Byzantine monastery dispensary, or a medieval infirmary, or a Tudor still room, or a Victorian chemist's back room. The instructions in the 6th book of any of them would have been recognizable to any of the others. There is a further thing his rules quietly assume, which is that these materials had to travel. A drug gathered on a Cilician hillside might be sold in Rome, and getting it there in usable condition was its own craft. Dried material was packed tight to keep the air out, wrapped in leaves or cloth or paper, sealed into jars with wax or pitch, stowed away from the bilge and away from the heat of the deck. Resins were carried in skins, liquids in sealed pottery. A great deal was lost on the way, to damp, to heat, to breakage and to theft. And everything that arrived had a price on it reflecting all of that. When Dioscorides tells you what the good sort looks like and what the spoiled sort looks like, he is arming a buyer at the far end of a long and lossy chain. All of this, taken together, is why the book was useful to people whose medicine bore no resemblance to his own, a physician of the 12th century or the 16th. Held quite different beliefs about what illness was and what the body was doing. But the plants still grew on the same hillside, still had to be gathered in the same month, still had to be dried in the shade and kept in a dry box, and still went dull at the same rate. The parts of the book that are simply about matter and about care never went out of date at all, and they are the ballast that carried everything else across 1500 years of changing theory. Let us turn now to the first book itself, and to the sweetest smelling stretch of the whole work. If you were to open a physician's cupboard in a Mediterranean city of the 1st century, the things in the front rank would be the things in this book, and they would have come a very long way, spikenard from the mountains of northern India, carried overland, or by sea to the Red Sea ports, and then up into Egypt. Cinnamon and cassia from somewhere the Greeks were never entirely clear about, arriving by routes that traders guarded with deliberate misinformation. Frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, moving north by camel along the incense road. Cardamom, sweet flag costus, malabathrum. These were not everyday medicines. They were the expensive end of the trade, and a small jar of any of them represented a real sum of money in a shop. Dioscorides begins with iris, which is a homelier thing than what follows and perhaps a gentle way in. The part used is the rhizome, dug and dried, and what makes it valuable is that it develops its scent slowly as it dries, deepening over months into something soft and faintly like violets. He notes that the Illyrian and Macedonian sorts are best, describes the good root as dense and pale and sweet smelling, and the poor one as soft and worm-eaten, and lists its uses in coughs, in salves, in pessaries, and in the making of ointments. Orris root, as later centuries called it, was still being used in exactly this way in the perfume houses of Europe in living memory, and for exactly the reason he gives, that it fixes and holds other scents in place. Then spikenard, which he treats at unusual length, because there were several things sold under the name, and only one of them was the true article. He describes the true nard as a small root with a shaggy, hairy top, aromatic and slightly bitter, and works carefully through the imitations, the Celtic nard and the mountain nard, and the plain reed, like things sold to the unwary. This is the pattern all through the first book. The higher the price, the more space he gives to telling you how to spot a fake. And a reader who cared about nothing else would still have found the book worth the cost of copying for these passages alone. Saffron gets a chapter with a small personal warmth in it, because the best saffron in the world, he says, comes from Coricus in Cilicia. Cilicia was his own country. Coricus lay along the same coast he had grown up on, a place of caves and cliffs and crocus fields, and one imagines him writing that line with a certain quiet satisfaction. He describes good saffron as fresh in color, with a strong scent, slightly moist, staining the hand at once when rubbed, and gives its uses for inflammations of the eye, for the stomach, in plasters and in wines. He also, characteristically, warns that a large quantity taken inwardly is dangerous, which is true, and which almost nobody who has romanticized saffron since has bothered to mention. A good stretch of the first book is not about single substances at all, but about the making of scented oils, and this is where the physician and the perfumer stand side by side at the same bench. The method he describes has two movements. First, the oil itself is prepared, usually a fresh, mild olive oil, treated with astringent materials so that it will hold a scent rather than letting it slip away. Then the aromatic material is steeped in it, sometimes warmed gently, sometimes left in the sun, sometimes changed for a fresh batch of flowers several times over so that the oil grows steadily richer. The whole business takes days or weeks and involves a great deal of straining through cloth and pressing and settling. Rose oil is the one that most readers remember. Fresh petals are bruised and put into the prepared oil, left to stand, strained out, and replaced with more petals over and again until the oil carries the scent fully. The result was used for headaches, for inflamed eyes, for hot swellings, for burns, as a base for other salves, and simply as a pleasant thing to have. Lily oil, quince oil, marjoram ointment, the nard ointments, and the compounded perfumes with their long lists of ingredients all follow the same broad shape. Reading these chapters is a little like reading a very old cookery book. There are quantities and orders of operation, and small warnings about not letting a thing scorch. There is a domestic detail buried in these oil chapters that is easy to pass over and rather nice to hold. The finished oils were kept in vessels of alabaster or of dense pottery with narrow necks, sealed, and stored somewhere cool and dark, because heat and light spoil a scented oil faster than anything else. A great many small alabaster flasks of exactly this kind have been dug up around the Mediterranean, and they turn up in museum cases labeled as perfume bottles, which is true as far as it goes. They are also medicine bottles. The same little jar might hold something for a headache, something to rub on an aching shoulder, and something a person simply liked the smell of, and often it held one substance that did all three. Then he comes to the trees and to the things that weep out of them. Mastic from the lentisk bushes of Chios, which are cut in summer so that the resin runs and hardens into pale tears that are then swept up from the swept ground beneath. He rates the Chian mastic above all others, and it is a curiosity of the world that the same island still produces it in the same way, from the same cultivated bushes, and it is still graded by the size and clarity of the tears. Myrrh and frankincense come next, with the same careful sorting of good from indifferent, and then storax and galbanum and bdellium and ammoniacum and the other gums, each with its scent and its price and its particular work in a plaster or a fumigation. The most extravagant of them all was balsam, the resin of a small tree that in his day was grown. So the ancient writers all insist in only a couple of guarded groves in Judea. It was worth more than its weight in silver. It was habitually adulterated, and Dioscorides gives several tests for the true article, including how a drop of it behaves in water and how it stains a cloth. There is a famous story, told by others of his century, that when the Roman armies came through Judea, the balsam trees themselves were fought over, and that a specimen was carried in triumph through the streets of Rome as a trophy. A plant paraded like a captured king. Whatever the truth of that, the plant's reputation was such that the story was believable, and that tells you enough. Pitch and tar close out much of the tree material, and here the register drops abruptly from the palace to the shipyard. He describes how pitch is got by burning resinous wood in a covered pit, so that the tar runs out below, how the thinner and thicker sorts differ, and how the black stuff was used on wounds and on beasts and in plasters that had to stick. There is also a description of collecting the oily condensate from the smoke of burning pitch, a substance used for eye complaints and skin trouble. It is a reminder that the same book which begins in a cloud of frankincense will happily spend a page on something scraped off the inside of a burning pit. The first book ends among fruits and pressed oils and a handful of odd items that sit where they sit for reasons now lost. Almond oil and the oils of the nut kernels, the palm and its dates, various astringent fruits. It trails off, as the ends of ancient books often do, without ceremony. It is worth spending a moment on the road these things came by, since it stands behind every chapter of the first book. The incense trade ran north out of southern Arabia, along a chain of watering places and walled towns, each of which grew rich simply by being a day's march from the next one. Camels carried the loads. Every town along the way took its share, in duty or in fee or in the price of fodder, so that a resin which cost a modest sum, where it was tapped, had multiplied many times over by the time it reached a Mediterranean port. From there ships took it on. The whole system was old before Rome existed, and it worked because the demand at the far end never slackened, since temples burned incense daily, and physicians and perfumers wanted the same materials. The perfumer's shop at the receiving end was a place of some sophistication. There were vats of oil in various stages of preparation, presses, strainers, cloths, a great many small vessels, and a considerable smell. The perfumer bought the same resins and roots as the apothecary from the same merchants, and made things that were sold as luxuries and used as medicines and given as gifts and burned at funerals, without anybody feeling the need to separate those purposes. When the first book of De Materia Medica moves without any apparent seam from a chapter on how to make a scented ointment to a chapter on what that ointment is good for, it is simply describing that shop as it actually stood. What stays with a reader from this first book is the smell of it and the sense of enormous distance. Nearly everything in it had crossed a sea or a desert. Every jar in that front rank of the cupboard was the end of a chain of hands running back through ports and caravanserais and mountain passes to some grove or field that no Greek physician had ever seen, and most could not have found on a map. The book is, among other things, a quiet inventory of the reach of the ancient trading world, and the fact that a doctor in a provincial town could reasonably expect to obtain any of it is more remarkable than the medicine. We turn now to the second book, and to a very different set of shelves. If the first book smells of resin and rose oil, the second smells of the farmyard and the kitchen. It begins with the things that living creatures give, and it begins, quite properly, with honey. Honey is one of the substances Dioscorides is warmest about. He rates the honey of Attica highest, and within Attica, the honey from the slopes of Hymettus, which was already a byword. He describes good honey as sweet with a faint sharpness behind the sweetness, fragrant, thick, sticky enough to draw out in a long unbroken thread when lifted on a finger. Its work, in his account, is to cleanse, to open, and to draw out. It is put on foul and stubborn wounds and sores. It is boiled with water into hydromel and drunk for coughs and for weakness. It is mixed with vinegar into oxymel, which he treats almost as a household staple. It preserves other things. It makes bitter medicines swallowable. That first use, honey laid on a wound that will not close, is one of the places where this very old book and modern hospitals ended up in the same room. Medical honey, dressings, prepared and sterilized under modern conditions, have been used in wound care in recent decades, and the reasons given for their action, that honey draws water out of the wound and holds it in a state where the things that spoil a wound do poorly, are not so very far from the language of drawing and cleansing that he used. There is no need to make this larger than it is. He did not know why. He knew that it worked, said so plainly. And the observation lasted long enough to be picked up again. After honey come the wax and the propolis, and then the milks. He distinguishes them all carefully, the milk of the goat, and the sheep, and the cow, and the ass, and notes what each is good for, the thinner sorts for the bowel, and the thicker for building someone up. Whey gets its own treatment as a gentle cleansing drink. Cheese appears, fresh and salted, and butter, which he treats slightly at arm's length, as something the northern peoples eat, and which in the Mediterranean world was mostly a medicine and an ointment rather than a food. Fats and marrow follow, sorted by animal, each with its own softening quality. Then a substance that deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the strangest and most enduring items in the whole book. The Greeks called it asypum, and it is the greasy stuff that comes out of unwashed sheep's wool, gathered and cleaned, and worked up into a soft ointment. Dioscorides describes how it is prepared, by washing and beating and settling the fleece water until the grease rises and can be lifted off. It was used for sore eyes, for inflamed places, for chapped skin. It is the substance we now call lanolin. It is still lifted off the wash water of wool scoring, and it is still in the ointments and the hand creams on a great many bathroom shelves tonight. The creatures themselves make an odd little procession. Snails, crushed and applied. Sea urchins and cuttlefish bone. Sponges, both for cleaning wounds and burnt to ash for other uses. The blistering beetles, which he handles with real care, since they raise a blister deliberately and are dangerous if taken inwardly. Castoreum from the beaver, an item that stayed in European pharmacy for the best part of 2,000 years afterwards. Various shellfish. It is a section that modern readers sometimes find comic. And it is worth remembering that a good deal of it was arrived at by the same trial and observation as the plants, and that the ones which did nothing mostly fell away in the centuries afterwards, while a few of them did not. The grains follow, and with them the whole soft middle ground between food and medicine, wheat and barley, and above all the barley preparations, the ptisin, a thin, strained barley water that had been the standard sickroom drink of Greek medicine since the Hippocratic writers, and would go on being spooned into invalids in European households for another 18 centuries. Starch boiled out of grain for soothing. Bran warmed and made into a poultice. Millet, and a small domestic detail that has charmed generations of readers. A bag of millet warmed by the fire and laid against a pane, which is to say the hot water bottle, several centuries before anyone had a bottle to put water in. The barley water deserves a little more than a passing mention, because of how long it lasted, and how gentle a thing it was. It is made by boiling barley for a long time in a great deal of water, and then straining off the liquid, sometimes with a little honey, sometimes with a squeeze of something sour. It is nourishing without being heavy. It is easy to swallow, and it goes down when nothing else will. The Hippocratic writers had already made it the standard sustenance for the seriously ill, and it stayed that way. It is in the medieval sick room, in the early modern household book, in the Victorian nursing manual, and in a good many 20th century kitchens, where somebody's grandmother made it for a child with a fever, without knowing that she was carrying out an instruction too, and 500 years old. The sea supplies a small run of chapters that feel very much like the work of a man who lived within reach of a harbour. Sponges, which were cut from the rocks by divers, and which appear both as a cleaning material for wounds and, burnt to ash, as a medicine in their own right. Cuttlefish bone, ground to a fine powder and used on the eyes and the skin, exactly as it still turns up in some old-fashioned tooth powders. The purple shellfish, whose dye made the most expensive cloth in the world, and whose flesh and shell had their own uses. Sea salt, and the foam that gathers along a tide line, living on that coast. None of these would have needed to be bought at all. Then the pulses, lentils and beans and chickpeas, and the bitter vetch and fenugreek, each with its cooking and its poulticing use. And then the section that lifts the whole book's temperature, the sharp herbs, garlic at length, warming and thinning and cleansing, good against the bites of things and against the coughs of winter, and eaten by working people everywhere. Onion and leek. Mustard, which draws heat to the skin and which turns up as a plaster in every century since. Cress and rocket and radish. These are the cheap medicines, the ones a family already had, and their presence in the same volume as the beaver and the cuttlefish is a fair picture of how ancient medicine actually worked. Reaching for whatever was to hand and paying close attention to what happened next. Let us turn now to the middle of the work, the third and fourth books, where the great green mass of it lies. This is the part a herbalist would have lived in. The costly aromatics of the first book were for those who could afford them, and the farmyard materials of the second were for everyone. But the third and fourth books are the working pharmacy proper, the several hundred roots and herbs and seeds and juices that a physician anywhere around the Mediterranean might actually gather or buy without much trouble. Read slowly. It is a long, calm procession, each plant standing up briefly, saying what it is and where it grows and what it does, and standing down again. Gentian comes early, and it carries a small piece of history in its name. The root is thick and bitter, gathered from mountain ground, and its bitterness is the point, since bitter things were held to rouse a sluggish stomach and stir the appetite. Dioscorides says the plant was found out by Gentius, a king of the Illyrians, and named after him, and the name has stayed attached for 2,000 years through every change of language and system since. There is something quietly pleasing in the thought that a small Balkan king, whose kingdom lasted a handful of years, is still spoken of daily by people who have no idea they are doing it every time somebody names a blue flower or a bitter tonic. Wormwood follows the same bitter family. He describes the plant notes the best growing country, and gives its uses for the stomach and against worms in wine and in decoction. Its close relations, southernwood and the other artemisias, sit near it in the book, which is exactly the affinity arrangement doing its work, keeping the bitter aromatic family together, so that a reader learns them as a group. Absinthites, the wine of wormwood, appears here and again in the 5th book, and it went on being made in Europe, under one name or another, until very recently indeed. Licorice is treated with obvious approval. The root is sweet, and he notes that it soothes a rough throat and a cough, and that chewing it quenches thirst, which is why it was carried by people who expected to be a long way from water. It also appears as a sweetener and a smoother in mixtures that would otherwise be hard to swallow, and that quiet supporting role kept it in pharmacy, right through to the modern cough sweet. His description of the plant, the pinnate leaves and the woody, sweet, pale root, is good enough to identify it from without any picture at all. Then a run of the great plain healers. Plantain, which the Greeks called lamb's tongue for the shape of its leaf, laid on wounds and bites and sores, and treated by him at some length because it was everywhere and everybody used it. Yarrow for bleeding. Comfrey, whose Greek name means to grow together, used exactly as later centuries used it, on broken places and on wounds, its thick root beaten into a paste. Marshmallow, whose whole virtue is its softening slime, boiled for soreness and for coughs, and for stiff painful swellings. Horehound for the chest. Betony, which the Romans thought extraordinarily useful, and which kept that reputation deep into the Middle Ages. Agrimony, hyssop, thyme, savory, oregano. Sage and rosemary both appear, and both are described with the affection of a man who has smelled them on a hot hillside. Mint in its several kinds, and pennyroyal, and the whole aromatic family of the labiates, which he clearly recognized as belonging together long before anyone had a word for a plant family. Fennel, and dill, and anise, and cumin, and coriander, and celery seed. The digestive seeds, sitting in their own neighborhood as they should. It is one of the more striking things about reading him closely. Again and again the groupings. He arrived at by feel, by scent and taste, and what the plants do, land close to groupings that botany worked out much later, by looking at flowers. Dittany of Crete gets one of the book's more charming stories, and he tells it, as usual, at a slight distance. The plant grows on the Cretan mountains, and the old accounts say that wild goats, when they have been struck by a hunter's arrow, seek it out and eat it, whereupon the shaft works its way out of the wound. He reports the tale, and then gets on with the plant's actual uses, which run to wounds and to difficult births. The story is much older than him, and outlived him too, turning up in Roman poetry, and in medieval bestiaries, and in herbals for another 1500 years. And it is a fine example of a piece of lore traveling along inside a technical book, like a seed in a bird. Celandine carries another. Its Greek name comes from the word for a swallow, and the old belief was that swallows use the plant to restore the sight of their nestlings. Dioscorides notes the name and the story, describes the plant with its brittle stems, and the startling orange juice that runs when you break one, and records its use for the eyes and for clearing marks from the skin. The juice is fierce, and he says so. What lingers is the image of somebody, at some unrecorded moment, watching a swallow near a plant, and drawing a conclusion, and that conclusion traveling down 2,000 years of writing. There is a whole small genus that carries a physician's name to this day because of these books. Euphorbia takes its name from Euphorbus, who was doctor to King Juba of Mauritania, a scholarly monarch who wrote about natural history himself, and who, the story goes, named a plant after his physician. Dioscorides describes the harsh milky juice of the plant, collected by scoring the stem, and is careful about it, since it burns and blisters, and was used only in small quantities and with respect. The name has now been attached, by later botanists, to an enormous worldwide family of plants, most of which nobody in the ancient world ever saw. Then the strong purges and the resins that go with them, scammony and tragacanth, and the rest, and aloe, which came from the east, and from the island the Greeks knew as the place where the best of it grew. Aloe is one of the substances he treats generously, giving its appearance, its bitterness, its uses for the stomach and the bowel, and for wounds and for the eyes, and how to tell the good glassy sort from the poor, gritty one. And rhubarb, which came from beyond the Black Sea, and took its Greek name from a river of the far north, a root traded an enormous distance for the sake of its action on the bowel, and which stayed one of the most valuable articles in European pharmacy right through the age of sale. Willow appears here too, quietly, without any hint of what it would come to mean. He notes that the leaves and the bark of the willow are binding, that a decoction of them is used for aches and for hardness and for inflamed places, and that the juice pressed from the leaves is dropped into the ear. It is a short chapter among hundreds. Nearly 18 centuries later, chemists working on willow bark would isolate the substance that gives it its action, and the whole story of the most widely taken medicine in the world would begin from there. He had no idea. He simply wrote down that willow eases pain, because it did, and the note sat there patiently in every copy of the book for 1800 years, waiting for someone to be able to explain it. It is worth admitting how much of this middle section nobody can now identify with certainty. Somewhere between 1/10 and 1/5 of the plants in these books, depending on whose reckoning you trust, remain doubtful. The description is too brief, or the distinguishing feature he chose is one that several plants share, or the name has migrated so far since that following it backwards leads nowhere. Scholars have spent careers on individual chapters. There are plants about which the argument has run for 200 years and shows no sign of settling. It is a strange and rather companionable thought that somewhere in these pages are perhaps 100 plants that a man walked out and looked at carefully and wrote down honestly, and that we have simply lost track of which ones he meant. And there is the other side of it. The great majority are identifiable, often instantly, and a modern reader with a field guide can walk a Greek hillside in early summer and find a very large number of them growing exactly where he said they grow. The thyme and the savory and the oregano on the dry stony ground with the heat coming off it. The mallows along the track, the plantain underfoot wherever people walk, the gentians higher up. It is one of the quiet pleasures of this book that so much of it can still be checked out of doors, in the same country, in the same months, 2,000 years later. That is really the character of these two central books. They are not clever. There is no theory being advanced, no argument being won. There is simply an enormous quantity of careful, unglamorous observation set down in a consistent form by a man who had walked a great deal and asked a great many people what they used. Some of it is wrong. A good deal of it is right. Nearly all of it is honest about which is which, and that is a rarer quality in a book than being right. We turn now, gently, to the harder chapters, the ones a reader comes to towards the end of the fourth book and finds the ground changing under them. Every serious pharmacological writer of the ancient world had to deal with the plants that harm, and Dioscorides deals with them at length and with a very level voice. His reasons are practical. A physician needed to know these plants in order to use the useful ones carefully, to recognize what had happened when someone had been given one by accident or on purpose, and to avoid gathering one by mistake in place of something harmless that it resembles. None of this is written with any relish. It reads exactly like the rest of the book, which is part of what makes it striking. The longest and most consequential of these chapters is on the poppy and its juice. He describes the plant, the several kinds, and then the collecting of the juice, which is done by scoring the seed capsule with a blade after the petals have fallen, letting the milky sap weep out and gather, and scraping it off when it has thickened. He distinguishes the strong juice got this way from the weaker preparation made by pounding the whole plant, and he gives tests for adulteration, since it was expensive and was habitually bulked out with other gums and juices. Its uses, as he gives them, are for pain, for sleeplessness, for coughs, for looseness of the bowel, and in eye preparations. And then the warning, plainly stated, that taken in too great a quantity, it causes a heavy stupor from which a person does not wake, and that it must therefore be given in very small amounts and with the greatest care. That warning is worth sitting with for a moment, because of how early it is and how exactly it names the thing. There is no mystification in it. He does not say the drug is cursed or that it belongs to any god. He says it eases pain, it brings sleep, and beyond a certain small quantity it kills, and here is roughly where that quantity lies. Every subsequent century of European medicine inherited both halves of that sentence together, the usefulness and the danger bound into the same paragraph, and the long, complicated history of this one plant in medicine runs directly out of these few hundred words. Mandrake gets the chapter that historians of surgery come back to most often. He describes the plant, the large forked root, the pale flowers, and the yellow apples, and then he describes a wine made by steeping the root, and says that it is given to those who are about to be cut or cauterized, so that they do not feel the pain, and that they lie insensible for a time, and then come round without remembering. That is, in a first-century book, a plain description of surgical anesthesia. It was not reliable, and it was not safe, and later centuries would go on using mandrake and henbane and poppy together in the sleeping sponges of medieval surgery with mixed and sometimes fatal results. But the intention is there, set down calmly, that a patient facing the knife should be spared the feeling of it. Henbane sits nearby, as it should, since it belongs to the same family and does similar work. He distinguishes the kinds by the color of the seed and the flower, says which are more dangerous, and warns that the black sort brings on a disordered mind and a sleep that is not sleep. Its uses are chiefly external, in plasters for pain and swellings, and in drops for the ear and the eye. And he is markedly more cautious about giving it inwardly than about many other things in the book. Hemlock he treats with the sober attention of a man writing in a Greek world, where everybody knew exactly what hemlock was for. It was the state poison of Athens, the cup given to the condemned, and the most famous death in Greek philosophy was by it. Dioscorides describes the plant carefully, which matters because it grows commonly along ditches and paths and resembles several harmless things, describes what it does to a person, and confines its uses almost entirely to the outside of the body, in cooling applications. It is a chapter that reads like a warning notice. Hellebore, black and white, occupies a good deal of space, because for the ancient world it was the great purge, and a physician was expected to know it thoroughly. It was gathered particularly around Anticyra, and the town was so associated with the drug and with the treatment of madness that to tell a man to sail to Anticyra had become a Greek way of telling him he needed his head seen to. Dioscorides describes the preparation of the root, the graded doses, the signs that the dose has been too large, and the measures to take when it has. Reading it is uncomfortable because the margin between the working dose and the harmful one was narrow, and he knew it was narrow, and said so. Aconite closes out this dark stretch, and he calls it by names that describe what it was used for. It was smeared on meat and put out to kill wolves and the great cats, and one of its Greek names means the panther strangler. He gives no internal use of any kind. This is one of the few plants in the entire work about which he has essentially nothing good to say, and he includes it anyway, because a person walking a hillside gathering roots needs to be able to recognize it and leave it standing. The Mandrake chapter had a very long afterlife, and it is worth following for a moment because it shows how a paragraph can turn into a practice. Medieval surgery, particularly in Italy from the 12th century onward, used something called the sleeping sponge. A sponge was soaked in a decoction of mandrake and henbane and poppy and one or two other things, then dried and kept. When it was needed, it was moistened again and held under the patient's nose, and the vapor, the surgeon said, brought on a sleep deep enough for cutting. Recipes for it survive in several manuscripts with slightly different proportions. Whether it worked reliably is very doubtful, and the margin between insensible and dead must have been alarming. But the whole practice traces back through a long chain of texts to a 1st century physician writing that a wine of mandrake root is given to those about to be cut. There is one plant in this stretch whose story turned entirely around, and it is a good illustration of how slowly these things move. The autumn crocus, the one that throws up bare purple flowers out of the grass in September, is described by him as harmful, and he warns against taking it and gives the signs of poisoning and something to give afterwards. He was quite right. It is a dangerous plant, and yet within a few centuries physicians had begun using it in very small quantities for a particular kind of joint pain, and it went on being used for that purpose right through to the modern day, where the substance extracted from it is a real and licensed medicine, handled with the same wariness he showed. The plant did not change. What changed was the accumulated experience of exactly how little of it to give. There is a small textual note that belongs here. and then we can leave this part of the night behind. 2 further books, one on poisons and their antidotes, and one on venomous creatures, traveled attached to Materia Medica through most of its history, and were read as his for centuries. Modern scholarship mostly considers them the work of other hands, added early and carried along by the reputation of the main text. It is a small illustration of what happens to a book that becomes an authority. Things attach themselves to it in good faith and travel a very long way under its name, and it takes a great deal of patient work by a great many people to separate them out again. None of this stretch of the book was written to frighten anyone, and there is no reason at all for it to unsettle you now. It is simply what an honest catalogue of medical material looked like in a world where the same hillside grew the cure and the poison side by side, often within a few paces of each other, and where the only protection anybody had was knowing which was which. Let us turn now to the 5th and last of the books, which begins in the vineyard and ends underground. The vine occupies the opening of it, and at some length, because wine in the ancient world was not simply a drink. It was the universal solvent and carrier of medicine, the thing you put a powder into so that it would be taken up by the body, the base of an entire class of preparations, and a medicine in its own right. Dioscorides works through the kinds carefully, new wine and old wine, and how their effects differ, sweet wines and dry ones, wines from particular districts with particular characters, white and dark, thin and thick, wine with sea water added, which was common along the coasts, and which he notes disturbs the stomach, wine with pine resin in it, which kept better, and which is the direct ancestor of a drink still made in Greece today. He is clear-eyed about wine itself. Taken moderately, it warms, nourishes, helps the appetite, colors the complexion and lifts the spirits. Taken immoderately, it does the opposite of all of those things, and he lists the consequences without any moralizing at all, the way he lists the effects of anything else. Old wine is stronger and goes more quickly to the head. Sweet wine sits heavier. Thin white wine passes through more readily and is easier on someone unwell. Every one of these observations is the kind of thing that gets rediscovered every few centuries and presented as new. Then come the medicated wines, and there are a great many of them. The method is simple and endlessly variable. You take a herb or a root or a resin, and you steep it in wine, sometimes in the must before it has finished working, sometimes in the finished wine, and you leave it to stand for a stated time, and then strain it. Wormwood wine, bitter and stomachic, hyssop wine for the chest, myrtle wine binding, rose wine, squill wine made from the great bulb of the sea onion, which he treats at length, and which was one of the standard preparations of the ancient world. Wine of hellebore, which is exactly as serious a thing as it sounds. Wines with pepper, with myrrh, with pitch, with a dozen other things. Alongside them stand the honey drinks, which fill the same role for those who could not take wine or should not have it. Hydromel, honey and water, fermented or unfermented. Melicreton, honey mixed into water fresh. Onomyle, wine and honey together. These are the mild carriers, the ones given to the very young and the very old and to people in fevers, and they run right through the ancient sick room. Vinegar gets its own careful treatment, and with it a drink that Dioscorides himself must have swallowed more times than he could count. Vinegar mixed with water was the ordinary field drink of the Roman soldier, cheap, keeping well in hot weather, and safer than most of the water available on a march. He notes its cooling and cutting properties, its use in fevers and in bleeding, its power to break up thick matter. Then oxymel, vinegar and honey boiled together. One of the great survivors of the whole pharmacopoeia, still being made in kitchens and in still rooms in the 19th century, and appearing in printed household books under the same name he gave it, and squill vinegar, sharp and strong, which had a reputation for keeping people well through a bad season. And then, about halfway through the 5th book, the whole work steps out of the living world entirely. What follows is the mineral cupboard, and it is a genuinely strange thing to come upon after 4.5 books of leaves and roots. These are the materials that come out of mines and furnaces and evaporating pans, and they are prepared by fire rather than by drying. Dioscorides describes how each is obtained, how it should look, how the good sort differs from the poor, and how it is prepared for use, which usually means some combination of washing, grinding on a stone with water, burning, and quenching. The copper materials come first in force. Verdigris, the green crust that forms on copper exposed to vinegar fumes, scraped off and used in salves for stubborn sores and for the eyes. Burnt copper, roasted with sulfur or salt until it changes character. The various copper ores which he distinguishes by color and by how they break. All of these are astringent and biting, and all of them were used on the outside of the body in preparations for wounds and eyes and skin. He is careful about them and about the danger of the fumes to the people who prepared them, which is one of the earliest notes of that kind anybody wrote down. Then the lead materials, which occupied an enormous place in ancient pharmacy and which read uncomfortably now. Litharge, the yellowish oxide skimmed from molten lead. White lead, made by standing lead over vinegar in a closed vessel until a white crust forms, then scraping it. Red lead. These went into plasters and salves and cosmetics in very large quantities, and the plaster made with litharge and oil, called a diachylon, stayed in continuous use in European surgery for nearly 2,000 years. He describes the making of them precisely, and he notes that white lead taken inwardly is deadly and gives the signs of it. The ancient world was not ignorant of the danger. It simply weighed it differently than we would. Rather more happily, there is the whole zinc family, which he knew as the pale, light material that gathers in the flues and on the walls of copper furnaces. He describes several grades of it, the light fluffy sort that rises highest, and the heavier sort that settles lower, and the washing and grinding needed to make it fit for use. It went into eye salves and into ointments for sore and weeping skin. That material, under a later name, is the white cream that is still put on a baby's sore skin tonight in a great many households, and it is doing very much the same job for the same reason, and the line of use between there and here has never entirely broken. If you set the whole mineral section out as a shelf, it makes a picture that stayed recognizable for a very long time. Jars of white and yellow and red powders, each one heavier than it looks. A green crust in a lidded pot, grey lumps of alum, a block of sulfur, brimstone yellow, bowls of fine clay, some of them stabbed, salt, lime, and, tucked away where it could not spill, a small sealed vessel of quicksilver. which every generation that handled it found unnerving, and every generation went on handling anyway. That shelf sat at the back of dispensaries from the Roman Empire through the Middle Ages and into the modern chemist's shop, losing an item here and gaining one there until quite recently. It is easy to be superior about the parts of it that we now know were harmful, and there is no need to be. The people preparing these materials were often perfectly aware that they were dangerous. Dioscorides says so, repeatedly and specifically. What they lacked was any way of measuring slow harm, the kind that accumulates over years and shows up as something that looks like an ordinary illness. Fast poison they understood very well. Slow poison was effectively invisible to them, and it stayed largely invisible for another 1800 years, which is why the lead plaster outlived so many of the things that were tried alongside it. Alum gets a long chapter because it was one of the great workhorses, binding and drying, used in the mouth and on wounds and in dyeing and in a dozen trades. Sulfur, natron and salt follow, and the sea foam and quicklime and gypsum, and then the earths, which are among the most charming items in the whole book. The earths were fine, soft clays, dug in particular places, prized for the qualities that a particular deposit had and no other. Simoleon earth, cooling, used in poultices. Samian earth, Armenian bowl, red and astringent. And, above all, the earth of Lemnos, which was dug on that island from one specific hillside, and which was made up into little flat cakes and stamped with a seal, so that a purchaser could see the mark and know that what he had was the true thing from the true hill. The sealed earth of Lemnos was traded across the Mediterranean, and then across Europe, and it was still being dug and stamped and sold under the same name in the 17th century. Later writers describe the digging as a yearly event, done on a set day with a good deal of ceremony and under supervision. There is a whole quiet economy visible behind that stamped cake of clay. Somebody dug it, somebody supervised, somebody pressed the seal, somebody shipped it, somebody sold it in a market 1,000 miles away, and somebody at the far end of the chain believed the seal. The book that named it did not create that trade, but it fixed it in writing, and every physician who read the chapter thereafter knew what mark to look for. Quicksilver appears near the end, and he treats it with visible unease, describing how it is got from cinnabar by heating and how it is collected, and warning about it in the plainest terms. Cinnabar itself, red and heavy, gets its own entry, mostly as a pigment and an external application. The processes described in this last stretch are worth a moment on their own, because they are the oldest recognizable pharmaceutical manufacturing instructions in European writing. There is washing, which means grinding a mineral fine, stirring it into water, letting the coarse particles fall, and pouring off the fine suspension to dry, so that what remains is soft enough to put on an eye without harm. There is burning, which means heating a substance in a crucible or on a fire until it changes color and character, sometimes with salt or sulfur added. There is quenching, plunging a hot material into water or wine or vinegar so that it shatters and takes up something of what it was quenched in. And there is levigation, the long, patient grinding of a powder on a flat stone with a muller, with a little liquid, until it is smooth between the fingers with no grit at all. Every one of those operations was still being carried out by hand in the back rooms of pharmacies in the 19th century, and the tools had barely altered. The porphyry slab and the muller, the crucible and the tongs, the sieve and the settling jar. A pharmacist of the 1850s, dropped into an ancient workshop, would have been at a loss for the language and entirely at home with the equipment, which is a reasonably good summary of what this book represents as a whole. The 5th book ends there, among furnaces and clays and heavy metals, a very long way in tone and in smell from the iris and spikenard of its opening pages. Whether Dioscorides felt the whole arc of that as he set it down, we cannot know. But a reader who works from the first line of the 1st book to the last line of the 5th has travelled from a perfumer's bench, through a farmyard and a kitchen, out across every hillside in the Mediterranean, and finally down into a mine, and has been shown the medical use of very nearly everything encountered along the way. We turn now to the question the whole night has been circling. Why this book, and not one of the others? Because there were others. Craterus had written his illustrated herbal. Sextius Niger had written on drugs. Half a dozen names appear in Dioscorides' own preface as men who had covered some of the same ground. And within a decade or two of his writing, in Latin rather than Greek, Pliny the Elder produced the Natural History, an enormous compendium in 37 books, a great deal of which concerns plants and their medicinal uses. Pliny was famous, well-connected, and prodigiously industrious. His work survived in full and was read continuously in the Latin West for the next 15 centuries. On the face of it, he had every advantage. The difference between the two men is visible in a page of either. Pliny was a compiler of a very grand kind. He read enormously, credited his sources scrupulously, and set down what they said, including a great deal that was wrong, contradictory, or frankly impossible, generally without adjudicating between them. He is a marvelous writer and an indispensable record of what the Roman world believed. He is not a safe guide to what a drug will do. Dioscorides is narrower, plainer, far less entertaining, and considerably more likely to be right, and where he is unsure he says so. Both books survived, but when a physician needed to know what to give someone, it was the narrow, plain, less entertaining one that came off the shelf. The decisive endorsement came from Galen, and it is hard to overstate what that meant. Galen of Pergamon, physician to gladiators, and then to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, was the most prolific and most influential medical writer the ancient world produced, and for the next 1400 years to disagree with Galen was to need a very good reason. He wrote his own vast work on the powers of simple drugs in 11 books, and he leaned heavily on Dioscorides throughout, and he said in so many words that Dioscorides had written the most complete account of the subject. That verdict traveled with the text. Anyone who accepted Galen, and virtually everyone did, thereby accepted Dioscorides, and the two of them moved through the centuries together, like a man and his shadow. It is worth knowing a little about Galen, since he is the figure standing over this whole story from the 2nd century onward. He was born in Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey, the son of a wealthy architect who gave him an excellent education, and then, according to Galen's own account, was instructed in a dream to direct the boy towards medicine. He studied in several cities, spent years as physician to the gladiators of his hometown, which taught him more about the inside of the human body than any other post available at the time, and then went to Rome, where he built a formidable practice and an even more formidable reputation for argument. He wrote on an enormous scale, and a great deal of it survives. His interest in drugs was systematic in a way that Dioscorides was not. Galen wanted to know why a substance did what it did, and he built a scheme of degrees, so that a drug might be warming in the first degree, or in the fourth, drying in the second, and so on, and so that the effects of a mixture could in principle be calculated from the effects of its parts. It is an elegant system, and it was wrong, and it dominated European medical thinking for well over 1,000 years. But it needed raw material, and the raw material it took was largely Dioscorides. The two of them fit together neatly, one man supplying the observations, and the other the theory, and the pairing was so useful that later centuries frequently spoke of them in the same breath. There is a further distinction running through all of this that is worth having, because it shapes how the book was used. A simple is a single substance, one plant or one mineral, considered on its own. A compound is a mixture. Materia Medica is a book of simples almost throughout, and Galen's great pharmacological work is likewise on the powers of simples. The compounds were the other half of the trade, and they grew steadily more elaborate over the centuries, culminating in preparations that contained 60 or 70 ingredients and took months to make, and were supposed to answer almost anything. The most famous of them was in continuous production in European cities into the 19th century. But every one of those enormous recipes was built out of simples, and the book that told you what the simples were sat underneath the whole edifice. But endorsement alone does not keep a book in use for 1,500 years. The deeper reason is structural, and it lies in the shape we looked at earlier. Because the book is made of hundreds of short, self-contained, uniformly built chapters, it could absorb change without breaking. A later reader who learned of a plant Dioscorides did not know could simply write a new chapter in the same shape and slip it in. A translator working into another language could render one chapter at a time. A physician in a country with a different flora could annotate the margins with local equivalents, and the book still worked. It was in a way that almost no other ancient text was open. Sacred books get defended. Argumentative books get refuted. Catalogues get added to. The late antique compilers show the process beginning. In the 4th century, Areius, physician to the Emperor Julian, made great medical collections that drew on Dioscorides constantly. In the 6th century, Areius of Amida did the same, and in the 7th Paul of Aegina did it again, and each of these compilations was itself copied and translated and carried onward. By the time the western half of the Roman Empire had come apart, the material of Materia Medica was no longer sitting in one place waiting to be lost. It was distributed through half a dozen widely copied works in several languages in a form that could be recombined, and that redundancy is very probably what saved it. Those late compilers deserve rather more than a passing mention, because they are the reason the chain never broke. Areius worked in the 4th century and assembled a vast medical collection at the request of an emperor, drawing on everything he could find and preserving, in the process, a great deal of earlier writing that would otherwise be entirely lost to us. Aetius of Amida, 2 centuries later, produced 16 books of the same kind, and his sections on drugs are largely Dioscorides rearranged and condensed. Paul of Aegina, in the 7th century, wrote a compendium in 7 books that became the standard practical handbook of the Eastern Mediterranean and was itself translated into Arabic and read for centuries afterwards. None of these men was original, and none of them pretended to be. They were sorters and condensers, and their profession has never had much glamour attached to it. But between them they took a large and scattered inheritance and packed it into forms that were portable, teachable, and cheap to copy. At exactly the period when the political world around them was becoming considerably less stable. If you want to know why the medicine of the ancient Mediterranean survived at all, a good part of the answer is that 3 or 4 unfashionable men spent their lives making tidy abridgments of it. There is one more quality, harder to name, that seems to matter. The book is not oppressive. It does not demand that you believe anything. It makes no claim to completeness or to finality, and its author's stated ambition is only that the account should be accurate and useful. A great many texts that dominated a field for centuries did so by closing it down. This one dominated by staying open, and by being, chapter after chapter for 800 chapters, simply worth having on the shelf. Let us turn now to the most beautiful copy of this book that has ever been made, and to the woman it was made for. Her name was Anicia Juliana, and she was, by birth, about as well connected as it was possible for a person to be in the Eastern Roman world of the early 6th century. Her father, Anicius Olybrius, had been emperor in the West, briefly and unhappily, in the year 472. Her mother descended from Theodosius. She married a general who held the highest military command in the East. She was, in effect, the last living representative of a very old imperial line in a city ruled by newer men, and she had a great deal of money and a very clear sense of what to do with it. What she did with it, principally, was build. Constantinople in her lifetime acquired several churches at her expense, and the greatest of them, dedicated to Saint Polyeuctos, was for a few years the largest church in the city, sumptuously decorated, carrying a long inscribed poem around its interior that made her descent and her generosity difficult for any visitor to overlook. It was surpassed, a few years after her death, by Justinian's Hagia Sophia. There is an old story, quite possibly invented, that this was rather the point of the exercise on both sides. Sometime around the year 512, in a suburb of the city called Honorata, a church was built with her support. And the people of that district, wanting to thank her, gave her a book. Not a service book and not a scripture. They gave her an enormous, magnificently illustrated copy of De Materia Medica. It is worth pausing on the oddness of that choice, because it tells you something about how this text was regarded by then. A herbal is a working manual. Giving one as a gift of state to an imperial princess is a little like presenting a duchess with a beautifully bound engineering handbook, and yet it was evidently exactly the right thing to give. Either she was known to have a real interest in plants and medicine, which several scholars think likely, or the book itself had by the 6th century acquired a standing that made a splendid copy of it a fitting imperial object in its own right. Probably both were true. The volume they produced is the manuscript, now known as the Vienna Dioscorides, and it is one of the very great survivals of late antiquity. It runs to something close to 500 leaves of parchment, and it is large, the page roughly the size of a modern atlas, heavy enough that lifting it is a two-handed business. It contains something like 400 full page paintings of plants, and, unusually for a book of any age, we can say with confidence roughly when it was made and for whom, because it says so on its own opening pages. Those opening pages are among the most studied images in the history of the book. In one of them, Juliana herself sits enthroned in the center of an eight-pointed star, flanked by two female figures who are labeled as magnanimity and prudence. A small winged figure offers her the book, labeled as the longing of the lady who loves to build. At her feet another figure lies prostrate in gratitude, representing the thanks of the arts. Around the frame runs an epigram in praise of her, arranged so that the initial letters spell out a dedication. It is, so far as anyone knows, the earliest surviving dedication portrait of a living person in a book, and every author portrait and donor portrait made in Europe for the next 1,000 years stands somewhere downstream of it. There are other pictures before the plants begin, and they are just as interesting. One shows 7 physicians of antiquity seated together in conversation. Another shows Galen among a further group. In one, Dioscorides himself sits writing, while beside him an artist paints a mandrake from life, and a female figure representing discovery holds the plant steady for them both. It is a small painted argument about how knowledge is made. 450 years after the fact, and it is rather a generous one, giving the painter and the finder equal standing with the writer. In another of these frontispieces, Dioscorides is shown receiving a mandrake root from a figure of discovery, and at her feet a dog lies dying. That detail is the oldest surviving picture of a legend that would run through European folklore for another 1,000 years. The belief that the mandrake shrieks when pulled from the ground and kills whoever hears it, and that the safe method is therefore to tie the plant to a dog and let the animal do the pulling. The legend is not in the text of De Materia Medica. It attached itself to the book, as things do, and rode along in the pictures. Then the plants begin, and they run on, page after page, for the whole enormous length of the volume. Each plant is given a full page, painted against the bare parchment with no background, the leaves and the flower, and very often the root laid out clearly. Many of them are good enough that a botanist today can name the species without hesitation. Some are so exact that individual features of the leaf margin and the venation are correct. Others are more schematic, or have clearly been copied from a copy by someone who had never seen the living plant. The quality varies, which is itself informative, since it suggests a workshop drawing on several older exemplars of different ages and merits. Where those older exemplars came from is one of the standing questions of the subject. The paintings are far too accomplished to be an invention of the 6th century workshop, and the tradition of painted herbals ran back at least to Creteuas, the root cutter who served the king of Pontus more than 500 years earlier. A number of scholars think that some of the images in this manuscript descend, through an unknown number of intermediate copies, from that lost illustrated herbal. If so, then a person standing in front of the open case in Vienna is looking at the far end of a chain of copying that begins in a Black Sea kingdom before the Roman Empire existed. The text itself, in this copy, is arranged alphabetically. Dioscorides argued against precisely this in his preface, and the makers of the most magnificent copy of his work ignored him entirely. They did it because their reader would want to look things up, and because by the 6th century the alphabetical version was simply the version most people had. It is written in a large, formal Greek majuscule, the letters set out one after another without word division, in a single column beside or beneath the picture, which is exactly the kind of writing that is beautiful to look at and slow to read. Bound in with the herbal are several other works, which turns the volume into something closer to a small library of the natural world. There is a poem on herbs. There is a version of an old poem on venomous creatures and their bites, illustrated with snakes and scorpions and spiders. There is a treatise on birds, with a couple of dozen bird paintings that are, in their quiet way, as fine as anything in the plant sections. And there is a work on fishing and sea creatures. Somebody in that workshop, or somebody instructing it, wanted the finished gift to cover the whole living world between its boards, and very nearly managed it. The bird paintings bound in near the end are worth a small detour, because they are so unexpectedly lovely and so seldom mentioned. There are a couple of dozen of them, each bird standing alone on the bare parchment in the same manner as the plants, and a good many are identifiable at a glance. There is a bird that anyone would call a partridge, and one that is unmistakably a swan, and a heron, and small perching birds painted with real attention to the way the feathers lie. They are done with a lightness that the plant pages, for all their care, do not quite have. Somebody in that workshop enjoyed painting birds more than they enjoyed painting roots, and it shows across 1500 years. The colors themselves came from the same world the book describes. The greens and blues and reds on those pages were ground from minerals and plants of exactly the kind catalogued in the 5th book, and the 3rd, mixed with egg white or gum and water, and laid on with a fine brush. There is a pleasing circularity in it. The pigment that paints the picture of a plant and the medicine made from that plant were frequently prepared by similar processes from similar materials, sometimes by the same trade, and the boundary between the colourman and the apothecary in the ancient and medieval world was as porous as every other boundary we have met tonight. It took a great deal of labour. 500 leaves of parchment means a very large flock of animals, and the preparation of the skins alone would have occupied a team for months. Then the ruling, the writing, the laying out of space for each painting, the grinding and mixing of pigments, the painting itself, the binding. Nobody signed it. We do not know the name of a single person who worked on it, which is a strange thought to hold beside the elaborate care taken to record the name of the woman who received it. Anicia Juliana herself did not live very long after receiving it. She died sometime in the 1520s or thereabouts of the 6th century, having outlived her husband, and her great church stood for several hundred years afterwards, before falling into ruin and eventually vanishing entirely from the surface of the city. It was found again in the 1960s, when excavation for a road turned up carved marble of extraordinary quality, and the long inscribed poem she had set around its walls was recovered piece by piece from the rubble. So the two things she is now best remembered for, the church and the book, both went underground for a very long time, and both came back, one out of the earth and one out of a library, within a few decades of each other. We turn now to what happened to that one volume afterwards, which is, for my money, the best part of the whole story. Most great manuscripts of this age survive because they were treasured and not used. They went into a treasury or a sacristy, were brought out on occasions, and spent the intervening centuries in the dark. This one had a different life. It stayed in Constantinople, and it stayed in use. And you can read the evidence of that on nearly every page. The first thing that happened over the following centuries is that the writing became hard to read. Greek handwriting changed considerably after the 9th century, moving to a smaller, joined, more efficient script, and the big formal capitals of the 6th century gradually became something that only a trained reader could follow at speed. So readers began adding transcriptions. Above or beside the old letters in the later hand, someone wrote out the plant names again in a script a contemporary could read at a glance. Then someone else added more. The margins begin to fill. By the early 15th century, the book was in the possession of the monastery of St. John the Forerunner, known as the Prodromos Petra, in Constantinople, and specifically it seems to have been connected with the hospital attached to it. A hospital, in the Byzantine sense, was a real institution with wards and staff and a dispensary, and the man associated with our manuscript at this point is named as Nathanael, a monk who served there in a medical capacity. The volume was, in other words, on the working shelf of a hospital, 900 years after it was painted for a princess. In the year 1406 it was falling apart, and it was repaired. A scholar and notary named John Chortesmenos, who later became a bishop, undertook the restoration, had it rebound, added a foliation so that the leaves could be kept in order, supplied a table of contents, and wrote a note recording what he had done and for whom. That note is the reason we know any of this. Tate is a small, practical, administrative piece of writing of the kind that libraries have always produced, and it is the hinge on which the whole later history of the book turns. The hospital it served was a serious institution and worth a moment of its own. Byzantine Constantinople had several of them, funded by monasteries or by wealthy founders, with wards separated by kind of illness, salaried physicians who attended on a rota, assistants cooks, a bathhouse, and a dispensary. One surviving foundation document for another such house sets out the staffing in exhaustive detail, down to the number of beds in each ward and the provision of a spare bed in case of overflow. These were not almshouses where the sick were left to recover or not. They were organized medical establishments several centuries before anything comparable existed in Western Europe. And a book like ours was part of their working equipment. Nathanael himself is little more than a name and a role. He appears in the note as a monk with responsibility for the sick, and that is essentially all we know of him. But someone in that position, holding a 900-year-old manuscript that was coming apart in his hands, went to the trouble and expense of having it properly restored rather than replacing it with a newer and more legible copy, which would have been by far the easier course. Whatever his reasons, and we will never know them. That decision is why the volume exists tonight. Then, in the year 1453, the city fell to the Ottomans, and the manuscript changed worlds without leaving the room. What it did not do was stop being used. The margins from this period fill with new hands writing in new languages. Arabic names for the plants appear beside the Greek ones. Ottoman, Turkish names appear. Hebrew names appear. Somebody, or rather a whole succession of somebodies, sat down with this ancient volume and patiently matched what it described against what they themselves called those plants, so that a physician in the Ottoman capital could find in it what he needed. That is not the behavior of a curator. It is the behavior of a working doctor with a reference book. Among the people who owned it in this period was, in all likelihood, Moses Haman, a Jewish physician who served Sultan Suleiman and who assembled a considerable medical library. The Haman family kept it after him, and in the year 1569 it was seen by a foreigner who understood exactly what he was looking at. His name was Ogier Gislin de Busbeck, who, a Fleming, ambassador of the Habsburg Emperor to the Ottoman court, and one of the more attractive figures of the 16th century. He was a collector of manuscripts, coins and plants, and he is remembered in gardens all over Europe because he sent tulip and lilac stock home from Constantinople. He wrote afterwards that the owner wanted 100 ducats for the Dioscorides, a sum, he said, too great for his own purse, but not for an imperial one. He arranged the purchase. The book travelled to Vienna, and there it has stayed. Busbeck is worth staying with for a moment, because he is such pleasant company. He spent the better part of 8 years in Constantinople on an exceedingly difficult diplomatic posting, was for part of that time kept under something close to house arrest, and appears to have filled the empty hours by collecting. He gathered coins and inscriptions and manuscripts. He kept a small menagerie. He wrote long, funny, observant letters home about everything he saw, and those letters are still read, because he had the rare gift of noticing ordinary things and describing them without condescension. And he sent plants and bulbs back to Vienna, among them, according to a very old tradition, the tulip and the lilac and the horse chestnut, so that a great many European gardens in spring are in some small part his doing. The wear on the manuscript tells its own story, and conservators read it the way a tracker reads ground. The pages that are most worn are not the beginning and the end, which is where a book that is merely admired gets handled. They are the pages of the more useful plants, in the middle, where fingers came down over and over on the same painted leaf. The lower outer corners are darker and thinner than the rest, from 1,000 years of being turned. Some of the pigment has been rubbed away in exactly the places where a person pointing at a picture would put a fingertip. Nobody recorded any of that deliberately. It is simply the shape that use leaves on a thing. Set the whole sequence out, and it is quite something. Painted in Constantinople for an imperial princess, read and annotated by Greeks for 900 years. Repaired for a monastery hospital in 1406, passed into Ottoman hands in 1450, and annotated in 3 more languages by physicians who still found it useful. Bought by a Flemish diplomat in 1569 and carried to Vienna, where it remains, catalogued now with a very plain library shelf mark, and listed by the United Nations among the documentary treasures of the world. One book, one physical object, made of the skins of animals that grazed in the 6th century, held open and turned, and written in by an unbroken succession of hands for more than 1400 years. There are very few things in the world that have been in continuous use for that long, and almost none of them are so easy to picture. Somebody's finger in every one of those centuries, coming down on a painted leaf and moving across to the line of text beside it. Let us turn now to the journey the book made eastward, and to the very large number of people who kept it alive while the West was busy with other things. The first move out of Greek was into Syriac. The Syriac-speaking Christian communities of Mesopotamia had, from the 6th century onward, a remarkable appetite for Greek learning, and their scholars translated a great deal of Greek medicine and philosophy into their own language long before anyone else did. A Syriac version of Materia Medica existed by the 6th or 7th century, and although the surviving evidence is fragmentary, it matters enormously, because Syriac became the bridge. When the great translation effort of the Abbasid Caliphate began, its scholars frequently worked from Syriac versions rather than directly from the Greek, and many of the Arabic renderings of Greek science passed through the quiet intermediate stage. The main event took place in Baghdad in the 9th century. The Abbasid caliphs, from the reign of al-Mansur onward, funded a sustained and extraordinarily well-organized effort to bring Greek learning into Arabic, and the central figure of it was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian physician from Hira, who translated an enormous quantity of Galen himself, and who supervised and revised the work of a whole school of translators. He was scrupulous. He hunted for the best manuscripts, compared copies, and left notes about the state of his sources that historians still rely on. De Materia Medica was translated into Arabic by a man named Istefan ibn Basil, which is to say, Stephen's son of Basil, and Hunayn went over the result and corrected it. What Istefan did when he came to a plant he could not identify is one of the more touching details in the whole history of the text. He did not guess, and he did not omit. He wrote the Greek name down in Arabic letters, transliterated but untranslated, and left it, with the express hope that some later reader, in some later generation, would recognize the plant and be able to supply the proper name. He was writing a note to a stranger a century or more ahead of him, and saying, in effect, "This one is beyond me. Perhaps you will know." The difficulty behind that gesture was real, and it was fundamental. Dioscorides described the flora of the Mediterranean. A physician in Iraq lived in a different country with different plants, and a great many of the herbs in the book simply did not grow anywhere he could reach. Some he could identify with local species. Some had names that had drifted. Some he had never seen and never would. This problem of matching the book to the ground would follow it everywhere it went for the next 1,000 years. And every generation that took it up had to do the work again. Which brings us to one of the most agreeable episodes in the entire story. And it begins with a diplomatic present. In the year 948, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine called Porphyrogenitus the Born, in the purple, sent gifts to Ad al-Rahman, the Umayyad Caliph in Cordoba. Among them was a magnificently illuminated Greek manuscript of Dioscorides. It was an inspired choice of present, generous, prestigious, useful, and entirely unusable, because there was apparently nobody in Cordoba who could read Greek. So the Caliph wrote back and asked for someone who could. And in the year 951, or thereabouts, a Greek monk named Nicholas arrived in Cordoba to work on the book. What followed was one of the earliest collaborative research projects we can put a date to. Nicholas sat down with a group of local scholars, among them the physician and diplomat Hasdai ibn Shaprat, who was one of the most remarkable figures at that court, and together they went through the manuscript plant by plant, matching Greek names against Arabic ones, sorting out the transliterations that Istefan had left standing a century earlier, and correcting what they could of the Andalusian version. It is worth picturing them at it. A Byzantine monk who had crossed the whole Mediterranean, a Jewish physician who ran much of the Caliph's foreign correspondence, and a room of Andalusian scholars, bent over a painted Greek book, arguing about what to call a plant. That is not a mythical golden age. It is a working meeting, with the tedium and the small triumphs that any such meeting has, and the result of it was that Cordoba became, for a while, one of the best places in the world to study plants. The scholarship that came out of it was substantial. Ibn Juljul of Cordoba wrote a commentary on Dioscorides, and then wrote a second book on the drugs that Dioscorides had not mentioned, which is precisely the correct response to inheriting a great reference work, to honor it, and then to extend it. Others made illustrated Arabic copies, some of them very fine indeed, and leaves from a beautiful illustrated Arabic Dioscorides, made in Baghdad in the early 13th century, are now scattered through museums across the world, each one a single painted plant on a single page. The tradition reached its height with Ibn al-Baitar, who was born in Malaga at the very end of the 12th century. He learned his botany in Andalusia, then traveled east, gathering plants across North Africa and the Levant, and eventually became chief herbalist to the Sultan in Cairo. His great work, a comprehensive book of simple drugs, gathers something like 1,400 items, and he cites Dioscorides constantly, quotes him, corrects him where his own field observation disagreed, and adds several hundred substances that the Greek physician never knew existed. It is exactly the same relationship to the book that Ibn Juljul had, and it is the healthiest possible one. Not reverence. Continuation. Hunin's own working methods deserve a moment, because they are startlingly modern. He wrote an account of the Galenic works he had translated, listing them one by one, saying which he had done and which his pupils had done, what state the Greek manuscripts were in, where he had found them, and how many copies he had been able to compare. He describes traveling in search of a single good text. He describes finding a work only in a poor copy and waiting years for a better one. That is the behavior of a scholarly editor, set down in the 9th century, and historians of textual criticism read it with something close to affection. The illustrated Arabic copies that came out of this tradition are among the most beautiful books of their kind ever made. One of the finest was produced in Baghdad in the early 13th century. Its plants painted in clear, flat color, with the text set around them in a graceful hand. It was broken up at some point by dealers who understood that individual painted leaves would sell more readily than a single heavy volume, and its pages are now in museums and private collections around the world. Scholars have slowly been reassembling it on paper, matching leaf to leaf by the handwriting and the ruling and the pattern of the wormholes, which is a painstaking and rather moving piece of work. Putting a book back together in a catalogue when it can never be put back together on a shelf. None of this was a rescue operation, and it is worth being clear about that, because the story is sometimes told as though the book vanished from Europe and was handed back later. It never vanished. It was in continuous use in the Greek, speaking East the whole time, and in a rougher form in the Latin West as well. What happened in Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo was not preservation but development. Several centuries of active work by people who were adding to it rather than merely holding it. When the material eventually flowed back into Latin Europe, through the translation workshops of Toledo and Sicily in the 12th and 13th centuries, what came back was larger and better than what had gone out. We turn now to the Latin West and to the cloisters, where this book had a quieter and in some ways sadder time of it. There was a Latin translation early, probably made in Italy in the 6th century, and it survives in manuscripts written a couple of centuries later in the south of the peninsula. It is not an elegant piece of work. It is literal to the point of clumsiness, translating word by word in a way that sometimes obscures the sense entirely, and it was clearly made by someone whose Greek was adequate rather than good. But it existed, and it circulated, and for a great many centuries it was the form in which the West knew Dioscorides directly. The institution that carried it was the monastery. The Benedictine rule laid it down that the care of the sick was to come before and above everything else, that they were to be served as if they were Christ himself, and an abbey of any size therefore had an infirmary and an infirmarian, and somewhere to grow the things the infirmarian needed. The famous 9th century plan drawn up for the Abbey of St. Gall, which was an ideal scheme rather than a building actually put up, sets it out with lovely clarity. There is the infirmary, beside it is the physician's house, and beside that is a walled garden, divided into a set of narrow raised beds, each one labelled with the name of a plant, most of which are straight out of the classical herbal tradition. That garden is the book made physical. Somebody read a manuscript and then went outside and dug beds and planted them accordingly. And the beds fed the infirmary, and the infirmary treated the monks, and very often whoever else turned up at the gate. It is a small closed loop of learning and practice, repeated in hundreds of houses across Europe for the best part of 1,000 years. And it is the reason so much classical plant knowledge survived at all in the Latin West. The infirmarian's day is not hard to reconstruct, because several houses left rules describing it. He rose with the community and then went to the sick before the others went to their work. He had the authority to give the sick meat and wine and a fire when nobody else in the house had any of those things, which in a strict order was a considerable dispensation, and shows how seriously the duty was taken. He kept the keys to the medicine cupboard. He was expected to be gentle, to be patient with complaint, and to sit up at night when sitting up was needed. In the larger houses he had assistants, and a bathhouse, and a separate kitchen, and a garden he could send someone out to at any hour. That garden and the cupboard it fed are the reason so many of these plants are still growing in Europe at all. A good number of the herbs in a modern garden center are Mediterranean species that would not naturally occur north of the Alps, and they are here because somebody carried seed or root over the mountains, planted it inside a wall where it was sheltered, and kept it going through winters it was not built for. Rosemary, sage, hyssop, lavender, fennel, rue. They came north as medicine, in the luggage of the classical tradition, and stayed on as garden plants long after anybody was using them for the reason they were brought. The copying happened in the same buildings. A scriptorium in a northern winter was a cold and uncomfortable place, and the labor of copying a long technical text with hundreds of unfamiliar Greek plant names in it was considerable. Scribes complained in the margins, as scribes always have, about the cold and the light and their aching backs. And they made mistakes, particularly with the names. Because a name you have never heard for a plant you have never seen offers your eye nothing to catch on. But the real trouble in the Latin West was not with the words. It was with the pictures. Consider what happens when an illustrated herbal is copied by a scribe who has never seen the plant. He is not drawing from life. He is drawing from another drawing as faithfully as he can, and any small ambiguity in the exemplar he resolves by guessing. Then his copy is copied by someone else in the same position, and the guesses accumulate. Over 5 or 6 generations of this, a recognizable painting of a plant slowly turns into a decorative pattern. The leaves become identical shapes repeated around a stem. The root turns into a flourish. The whole thing settles into a pleasing symmetry that has nothing whatever to do with any living thing. Historians of botanical illustration have traced this degeneration through surviving manuscript series, and it is a melancholy thing to look at laid out in sequence. A plant dissolving into ornament across 3 or 4 centuries. By the later Middle Ages, there were herbals in circulation whose pictures were entirely useless for identifying anything, and which were sometimes actively dangerous, since a person might gather the wrong thing in confidence. There was a second difficulty on top of it, and it was geographical. Dioscorides wrote about the plants of the Mediterranean. A monk in Bavaria or Yorkshire, or the Low Countries, lived among a substantially different flora, and a great many of the herbs in his book simply did not grow within 1,000 miles of him. So he did what everyone in that position has always done. He looked for the nearest thing he had, and gave it the Latin name from the book, and wrote the identification down. Sometimes the substitution was botanically reasonable, and the plant did something similar. Sometimes it was not, and a name became permanently attached to a northern plant that had no relation at all to the Mediterranean one it was named for. A surprising number of the odd, apparently arbitrary plant names in modern European languages are fossils of exactly this process. The surviving evidence of the early Latin version is itself a small pleasure to think about. It comes down to us chiefly in manuscripts written in the south of Italy in the 8th and 9th centuries, in a distinctive regional script that scribes of that area used for several hundred years, tight and angular and full of abbreviations, quite hard to read until you have learned it, and then perfectly legible. Those volumes were made in houses that stood on the same ground as ancient Greek-speaking settlements, in a part of Europe where Greek and Latin overlapped for a very long time. and that is almost certainly why the translation happened there, and not somewhere else. Geography does a great deal of quiet work in this story. There is also a whole class of northern books that carry the material without ever naming it. A monastic remedy collection compiled in Germany or England might contain 100 recipes, of which 20 are straight out of the classical tradition, 20 are local custom, and 60 are some blend of the two that nobody could now pull apart. Nowhere in such a book does it say where anything came from. The compiler was not writing a history. He was making something useful out of everything he had, and the archaeology of working out which layer came from where has occupied historians of medicine for a century, and is still going on gently in journals almost nobody reads, none of which stopped the book working. The northern herbals that came out of this period, the Old English herbarium, the leech books, the great monastic remedy collections, all carry classical material inside them, adapted and localized and mixed with native lore. Somebody in every generation had read the descriptions, walked out into his own country, made the best matches he could, and passed on the result. It was imperfect and it was patient, and it went on for a very long time. And the whole business was waiting for one particular thing to change before it could be put right. Let us turn now to the thing that changed, which was the printing press, and to the strange century in which this book reached the height of its authority and quietly began to lose it, both at once. The press arrived in the second half of the 15th century, and it did to Dioscorides what it did to every other text of standing. It made him cheap, uniform, and everywhere. The first printed edition was a Latin translation, produced in a small Tuscan town in the year 1478. The Greek text itself was printed in Venice in 1499 by the press of Aldus Manutius, whose editions of the Greek classics were among the finest things produced in that century or any other. Within a generation, there were competing Latin versions, the best of them a fresh and much more readable translation made in Paris, and the book that had traveled for 14 centuries as a scatter of hand-copied manuscripts, no two alike, became a stable object that a scholar in Antwerp and a scholar in Bologna could argue about, knowing they had the same words in front of them. Before Machioli, there was a generation of scholars who did something less glamorous and possibly more important, which was to work out what the text actually said. 15 centuries of hand copying had left the manuscripts full of small corruptions, misread letters, garbled Greek plant names, chapters transposed, marginal notes absorbed into the body of the text as though the author had written them. The humanist correctors set about untangling it, comparing manuscripts, restoring readings, and arguing with each other about the results in print, sometimes at considerable length and not always politely. A Venetian scholar produced a long volume of corrections that also went after Pliny with equal severity. It is dry work to read now. It is the foundation everything after it stands on. The other quiet development of the same period was the pharmacopoeia. Cities and guilds began to publish official lists of the drugs an apothecary must keep and how each was to be prepared, so that a physician's prescription would mean the same thing in every shop in town. The first of these appeared in Florence in the early 1500s, and others followed across Europe over the next century. Their contents are to a very large extent, the contents of Materia Medica, sorted and standardized, and given legal force. It is the moment the book stops being an author's account and starts becoming a public institution, and the institution has never gone away. The descendants of those lists are still published today, still called pharmacopoeias, and still tell you what a substance must be and how it must be tested. Then came Machioli, and Machioli deserves a chapter of his own in any account of this book. Pietro Andrea Mattioli was a physician from Siena who spent the greater part of his working life on a commentary on Dioscorides. He published an Italian version in 1540, and a Latin one a decade later, and then went on revising and enlarging it for the rest of his days. It was a phenomenal success by any standard, printing in enormous numbers for the period, translated into several languages, illustrated in the later editions with large and rather magnificent woodcuts. For most of the 16th century, if a person in Europe owned one book about plants, this was very likely the one. What made it so useful was that Machioli did not simply annotate. He built a network. He corresponded with physicians, gardeners, apothecaries and travelers across the whole of Europe and beyond it, asked them to send him specimens and drawings and descriptions of what grew where they lived, and folded what they sent into his commentary. The book, therefore, became a kind of clearinghouse for European botany, a place where information from 100 different regions was gathered and compared. He was also, by all accounts, an extremely difficult man who pursued his scholarly disagreements with a ferocity that startled even his own century. But the work is the work, and here is the paradox at the center of it. Machioli's commentary was the highest point of Dioscorides' authority. The moment when the whole of learned Europe organized its plant knowledge around his 5 books. It was also the beginning of the end, because the commentary kept growing and the text it commented on did not. Page after page of new plants that Dioscorides never described, sent in by correspondence, appeared as additions. The ancient text sat in the middle of the volume, like a small stone in a very large and steadily rising pile of new material. And eventually the obvious question could no longer be avoided. If most of what we now know is in the notes rather than in the text, why are we still organizing the subject around the text? 2 other things pushed in the same direction, and both of them were about looking. In 1530, in Strasbourg, a book appeared with a title that means Living Portraits of Plants. The text was conventional enough. The pictures were not. They were made by an artist named Hans Weiditz, working from actual specimens in front of him, and he drew what he saw with an honesty that nobody had attempted for a very long time. The leaves are not idealized. Some of them are wilted. Some have insect damage. One famous plate shows a specimen whose stem was evidently too long for the page, and rather than redesign the plant, the artist simply bent it over at the top. After 1,000 years of pictures copied from pictures, here was a picture copied from a plant. 12 years later, a physician named Leonhard Fuchs published a great illustrated herbal that went further, with hundreds of plates drawn from life, clear and generous and designed for identification rather than decoration. Fuchs did something else that was almost unheard of. At the back of the book, he printed portraits of the 3 men who had made the pictures, the draughtsmen who drew from the plant, the man who transferred the drawings to the woodblock, and the cutter who cut them, and he named all three. It is a small act of professional courtesy that says a great deal about what he thought the pictures were worth. At the same time, the plants themselves were arriving in quantities that no ancient catalogue could absorb. Ships were coming back across the Atlantic with maize and tobacco and chili and the potato and 100 other things, and coming back from the east with more, and none of them were in Dioscorides, because none of them had ever been within 1,000 miles of anyone he could have asked. That was the plainest possible demonstration that the ancient catalogue was not the world. The gardens founded in Italian university towns in the 1540s at Pisa and then at Padua were created precisely so that students of medicine could learn their Materia Medica from living plants in beds rather than from descriptions on a page. And those gardens filled steadily with things that had no classical name at all. From there the descent is gradual and rather gentle. Botanists began the enormous task of sorting out which of the thousands of names in circulation referred to the same plant, a labor that runs through the 17th century and reaches its resolution in the 18th, when a Swedish naturalist imposed the two-word naming system that we still use. Once plants could be named unambiguously and described from life, the old book was no longer needed as a reference. It became, instead, a historical document, which is a much quieter kind of importance. There is one last translation that belongs in this chapter, and it is my favorite thing in the whole story. In Hampshire, in the 1650s, while England was in the middle of a civil war and its aftermath, a quiet country gentleman named John Goodyear sat down and translated the whole of De Materia Medica into English by hand, all 5 books. He was a botanist of real ability who had spent his life looking at plants in the field, and he worked at the translation for several years, filling notebook after notebook in a small, patient hand. He never published it. He left his papers to an Oxford college, where they sat, largely unregarded, for the better part of 3 centuries. In the 1930s, a scholar found them, recognized what they were, and printed the whole thing. And Goodyear's English Dioscorides, made by candlelight in a Hampshire house while the country came apart around him, is the version that most English readers have used ever since. We turn now, as our evening draws in, to where the surviving copies rest tonight. The great illuminated volume made for Anicia Juliana is in Vienna, in the Austrian National Library, under a shelf mark of the plainest possible kind. It is very fragile now. The parchment of the most handled pages has thinned. Some of the pigments have rubbed where centuries of fingers came down on a favorite plant, and the binding has been renewed more than once, since the notary Chortesmanos had it seen to in 1406. It is rarely put on display and rarely opened at all. It was added to the International Register of Documentary Heritage in the 1990s, and it has been photographed page by page, so that anybody in the world with an evening to spare can now turn its 400 painted plants in the order they were bound, which is a thing no reader in 14 centuries has been able to do without permission and a monastery. There is a second great illustrated Greek copy, made a century or so after the Vienna one, which spent a long time in the same imperial collection and was transferred to Naples after the First World War. It sits now in the National Library there, less famous and in some ways more charming. Its plants painted several to a page in a livelier and looser hand. That Naples volume has its own small history of travel, and it is a reminder that manuscripts move for reasons that have nothing to do with scholarship. It was in the Imperial Collection in Vienna, alongside its more famous cousin for a very long time, and it was handed over to Italy after the First World War as part of the settlement, one item on a list of transferred property. Books have been moving that way for as long as there have been books and armies. Some of them have crossed Europe several times. The unglamorous truth behind a great many library shelf marks is a treaty, or a purchase made under pressure, or a scholar with good connections and a persuasive manner. There are other copies of a humbler kind scattered, rather more widely, and those are in some ways the more interesting ones. Small plain working manuscripts of the text, without pictures, written for someone who needed the words and could not afford the paintings. They sit in university libraries and cathedral collections and the occasional country house, catalogued briefly, seldom requested. Nobody photographs them for a calendar, but they are the ordinary body of the tradition, the copies that were actually opened beside a patient. And there are far more of them than there are of the beautiful ones. A third, made in Constantinople in the 10th century, is in New York, in a library built by a banker who collected manuscripts the way other men collected racehorses. There are further Greek copies in Paris, and Bologna and Florence, and in the libraries of the monasteries on Mount Athos, where some of them have simply stayed put for 800 or 900 years without ever going anywhere at all. And the leaves of the illustrated Arabic copies, broken up long ago by dealers, who found that single painted pages sold better than whole books, are scattered through museums on 4 continents, one plant to a frame, each of them a small orphan of a volume that no longer exists. On Mount Athos the situation is a little different from anywhere else, and rather wonderful. The libraries of those monasteries have never been dispersed, never sold up, never carried off wholesale to a national collection, and a manuscript that arrived in the 11th century may quite simply still be in the same house, on the same peninsula, in a room a few doors from where it has always been. Cataloguing them has been going on for well over a century and is not finished. Every so often somebody working through a shelf finds something that no scholar outside the mountain knew existed. There are copies of medical texts there, among a great many other things, and it is entirely plausible that not all of them have yet been properly described. And then there is the change that has happened within the last 20 or 30 years, which has quietly transformed all of this. Nearly every one of these manuscripts has now been photographed, page by page at high resolution, and put where anybody can see it. The Vienna volume, which for 14 centuries could be consulted only by someone who could reach the place where it was kept and persuade its keeper to open it, can now be turned leaf by anyone at all, at 2 in the morning, in any country for nothing. A person could look at every painted plant in it tonight without leaving the bed they are lying in, set against 1400 years of asking permission. That is a genuinely remarkable thing, and it has happened so gently that almost nobody has remarked on it. The people who look after all of these are, in the main, invisible. conservators who monitor the temperature and the humidity of a room within a degree, who make individual supports so that a spine is never opened further than it wants to go, who repair a tear in a 1400-year-old parchment leaf with a patch of Japanese tissue so fine you cannot see it, and who then write down exactly what they did and why, so that whoever comes after them in 100 years will know. It is the same kind of work that Chortesmanos did in 1406. The materials have improved. The impulse has not changed at all, and there is one more place the book survives, which is more diffuse and rather harder to point at. A great many of the names are still in daily use. When a botanist writes the formal name of a wormwood, or a gentian, or a marshmallow, or a comfrey, or a henbane, or a chamomile, or a spurge, the word being written is very often the Greek word out of these 5 books, carried forward by Linnaeus and his successors into the modern system, without anyone particularly remarking on it. The discipline itself carried his title for the best part of 2 millennia, and on the shelves of ordinary houses, tonight there is zinc oxide cream, and lanolin, and honey sold specifically for putting on wounds, and aspirin, whose ancestry runs back through willow bark to a short and unremarkable chapter in the 4th book. There is one further survival, and it is the least tangible of all. The habit of the thing has lasted. The habit of going out and looking at the plant rather than trusting the description. The habit of writing down what you saw and marking clearly which part you were told and which part you checked. The habit of saying how much and what happens if you give more. The habit of telling the reader how to know a good specimen from a poor one. None of that was invented by one man in the 1st century, but it was set down by him in a form clear enough to be copied for 1500 years, and it is very difficult to copy a habit for 1500 years without it becoming ordinary. The book itself has finished working. Nobody treats anybody from it now, and nobody should. Its long career as a manual ended somewhere in the 17th or 18th century, quietly, without any particular moment you could point to in the way that these things generally end. What it did instead was seed itself into everything that replaced it, and then lie down. We have come a very long way tonight, from a small Greek town under a ridge of rock in Cilicia, through 5 rolls of papyrus and 800 short, careful chapters, past the iris and the rose oil, and the honey and the willow and the hard, quiet chapters at the end of the 4th book, into a princess's painted volume in Constantinople, and out again through 1,000 years of hands writing in its margins, east into Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo, west into cold monastery copying rooms, and at last onto a printing press, and into a cool, still room in Vienna, where the whole thing now sleeps. If your eyes closed somewhere along that road, that was always exactly the point of the evening, and there is nothing at all to have missed. The book is closed now and back in its box. The lamp is out over the workbench. The jars are stoppered, and the herbs are hanging in the dark of the drying loft. And every question that this whole enormous, patient, 1500-year enterprise ever asked can wait until morning, or until some other morning, or until never. There is nothing left to remember, and nothing left to do. Let your shoulders go. Let your jaw unclench. Let the whole long weight of the day settle out of you, and into whatever is holding you up. You do not need to have followed any of it. The names can go. The dates can go. If all that is left in the morning is a vague impression of a hillside in summer, and a hand turning a painted page somewhere very far away, that is more than enough, and it is more or less all that anybody has ever really kept of this. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon, with another quiet chapter. Somewhere in a dark room, 500 leaves of parchment lie perfectly still in a case that keeps the air at one unchanging temperature, as they have for a very long time now, and will for a long time yet. And the last of the light goes softly out of the window, and there is only the quiet and the dark and the whole of the night ahead of you.